Chapter 61 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 61. That God is the most pure truth. The foregoing being established, it is evident that in God there is pure truth, in which there can be no alloy of falsehood or deception. For falsehood is incompatible with truth, even as black with white. Now God is not merely true, but is truth itself. Therefore, there can be no falsehood in him. Moreover, the intellect is not deceived in knowing what a thing is, as neither is the sense about its proper sensible. Now all knowledge of the divine intellect is as the knowledge of one who knows what a thing is, as was proved above. Therefore it is impossible that there be error, deception, or falsehood in the divine knowledge. Further, the intellect does not err about first principles, whereas it does sometimes about conclusions, to which it proceeds by arguing from first principles. Now the divine intellect is not argumentative or discursive, as we proved above. Therefore, there can be no falsehood or deception therein. Again, the higher a cognitive power is, the more universal and the more comprehensive is its proper object. Wherefore, that which the sight knows accidentally, the common sense or the imagination apprehends as included in its proper object. Now the power of the divine intellect is absolutely supreme in knowledge. Therefore all things knowable are compared thereto as knowable properly and per se, and not accidentally. But the cognitive power errs not about such things. Therefore it is impossible for the divine intellect to err about any knowable object. Moreover, an intellectual virtue is a perfection of the intellect in knowing things. Now the intellect cannot, according to an intellectual virtue, speak false, but always speaks true, because to speak true is the good act of the intellect, and it belongs to virtue to perform a good act. Now the divine intellect is more perfect by its nature than the human intellect is by a habit of virtue, for it is in the summit of perfection. It remains, therefore, that falsehood cannot be in the divine intellect. Further, the knowledge of the human intellect is somewhat caused by things, the result being that man's knowledge is measured by its objects, since the judgment of the intellect is true through being in accordance with things and not vice versa. Now the divine intellect is the cause of things by its knowledge, wherefore his knowledge must needs be the measure of things, even as art is the measure of the products of art, each of which is so far perfect as it accords with art. Hence the divine intellect is compared to things as things to the human intellect. Now falsehood resulting from inequality between man's mind and things is not in things but in the mind. Wherefore, if there were not perfect equality between the divine mind and things, falsehood would be in things but not in the divine mind. And yet there is no falsehood in things, because as much as a thing has of being, so much has it of truth. Therefore, there is no inequality between the divine intellect and things, nor is any falsehood possible in the divine mind. Again, as the true is the good of the intellect, so is falsehood its evil. For we naturally desire to know the true, and shun to be deceived by the false. Now evil cannot be in God, as was proved above. Therefore falsehood cannot be in him. Hence it is said in Romans 3:4, "But God is true." And in Numbers 33:19, "God is not as a man, that he should lie." And in the first letter of John, 1:5, God is light, and in him there is no darkness. End of chapter 61. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 62 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 62. That the divine truth is the first and supreme truth. From what has been proved, it clearly follows that the divine truth is the first and supreme truth. For the disposition of things in truth is as their disposition in being, according to the philosopher in the second book of Metaphysics. And this because truth and being are mutually consequent upon one another, since the true is when that is said to be which is, and that not to be which is not. Now God's being is first and most perfect. Therefore his truth is also first and supreme. Again, that which belongs to a thing essentially belongs thereto most perfectly. Now truth is ascribed to God essentially, as we have proved. Therefore his truth is the supreme and first truth. Further, truth is in our intellect through the latter being equated to the thing understood. Now the cause of equality is unity, as stated in the fifth book of Metaphysics. Since then, in the divine intellect and thing understood are absolutely the same, his truth must be the first and supreme truth. Moreover, that which is the measure in any genus must be the most perfect in that genus, wherefore all colors are measured by white. Now the divine truth is the measure of all truth, for the truth of our intellect is measured by the thing that is outside the mind, since our intellect is said to be true from the very fact that it accords with the thing. And the truth of a thing is measured according to the divine intellect which is the cause of things, as we shall prove further on. Even as the truth of art products is measured by the art of the craftsman. For then is a casket true when it accords with art. Also, since God is the first intellect and the first intelligible, it follows that the truth of every intellect must be measured by his truth, if each thing is measured by the first in its genus, as the philosopher teaches in the 10th book of Metaphysics. Hence the divine truth is the first, supreme, and most perfect truth. End of chapter 62. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 63 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 63. The arguments of those who would deny to God the knowledge of singulars. Now there are some who endeavor to withhold knowledge of singulars from the perfection of God's knowledge, and in support of their contention they proceed by 7 ways. The first is from the very nature of singularity. For since the principle of singularity is signate matter, it seems impossible for singulars to be known by an immaterial power, if all knowledge result from some kind of assimilation. Wherefore in us those powers alone which use material organs apprehend singulars, for instance, the imagination, the senses, and so on, while our intellect, since it is immaterial, knows not singulars. Much less, therefore, is the divine intellect cognizant of singulars, since it is furthest removed from matter. Hence by no means does it seem possible that God should know singulars. The second argument is that singulars are not always. Either, therefore, they are always known by God, or they are known at one time and unknown at another. The first is impossible, since about what is not there can be no knowledge, which is always about true things, and things which are not cannot be true. The second is also impossible, because the knowledge of the divine intellect is altogether unchangeable, as we have proved. The third argument proceeds from the fact that singulars do not all happen of necessity, but some contingently. Wherefore, there can be no certain knowledge about them except when they are. For certain knowledge is that which cannot be deceived, and every knowledge of contingencies, since these are future, can be deceived. Because the event may prove the opposite of that to which the mind holds, since if the opposite could not happen, they would be necessary. Wherefore, we can have no knowledge of future contingencies, but only a kind of conjectural estimate. Now we must suppose that all God's knowledge is most certain and infallible, as we have proved above. Moreover, it is impossible that God begin anew to know something, on account of his unchangeableness, as stated. Hence it would seem to follow that he knows not contingent singulars. The fourth is based on the fact that the will is the cause of certain singulars. Now, an effect, until it actually is, cannot be known save in its cause, for only thus can it be before it begins to be in itself. But the movements of the will cannot be known for certain by anyone, except the willer in whose power they are. Wherefore it seems impossible for God to have eternal knowledge of such singulars as have their cause in the will. The fifth proceeds from the infinity of singulars. For the infinite as such is unknown, because whatever is known is, in a way, measured by the comprehension of the knower, since measurement is nothing else than a kind of certification of the thing measured. Wherefore every act discards the infinite. Now singulars are infinite, at least in potentiality. Therefore it seems impossible for God to know singulars. The sixth proceeds from the pettiness of singulars. For as the excellence of knowledge is gauged by the excellence of its object, so apparently the pettiness of the object conduces to pettiness of knowledge. Now the divine intellect is supremely excellent. Therefore, it is incompatible with its excellence that God should know the most trivial of singulars. The seventh argues from the presence of evil in certain singulars. For since the thing known is, in a manner, in the knower, and since evil cannot be in God, as proved above, it would seem to follow that evil and privation are entirely unknown to God, and known only by an intellect that is in potentiality, since privation can only be in that which is potential. Hence it follows that God has no knowledge of singulars wherein evil and privation are to be found. End of chapter 63. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 64 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 64. Order of the things to be said about the divine knowledge. In order to refute this error, and moreover to show the perfection of the divine knowledge, we must carefully seek the truth about each of the aforesaid arguments, so as to disprove whatever is contrary to the truth. In the first place, then, we shall show that the divine intellect knows singulars. Secondly, that it knows things that actually are not. Thirdly, that it knows future contingencies with an unerring knowledge. Fourthly, that it knows the movements of the will. Fifthly, that it knows infinite things. Sixthly, that it knows all the most trivial and petty things. Seventhly, that it knows all evils and privations or defects. End of chapter 64. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 65 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 65. That God knows singulars. Accordingly, we shall prove first that God cannot be lacking in the knowledge of singulars. For it has been shown that God knows other things inasmuch as He is their cause. Now God's effects are singular things, because God causes things in the same way as He makes them to be actual. And universals are not subsistent, but have their being only in singulars, as is proved in the 7th book of Metaphysics. Therefore God knows things other than Himself, not only in the universal, but also in the singular. Again, as soon as one knows the constituent principles of a thing's essence, one must needs know that thing. Thus knowledge of the rational soul and of such a body implies knowledge of man. Now the essence of a singular is made up of signate matter and an individual form. Thus the essence of Socrates is made up of this particular body and this particular soul, even as the essence of man in general is made up of soul and body, as stated in the 7th book of Metaphysics. Wherefore, since the latter are included in the definition of man in general, so would the former be included in the definition of Socrates, if he could be defined. Hence, whoever has knowledge of matter, and of those things whereby matter is designated, and of the form individualized by matter, cannot be lacking in knowledge of the singular. Now God's knowledge reaches to matter, individualizing accidents and forms. For, since His act of understanding is His essence, it follows that He understands all that is in any way whatever in His essence, wherein are virtually, as in their first origin, all that have being in any way whatever, forasmuch as He is the first and universal principle of being, and among these we must include matter and accident, since matter is being in potentiality, and accident being in another. Therefore, God lacks not knowledge of singulars. Moreover, the nature of a genus cannot be known perfectly unless its first differences and proper passions be known. Thus the nature of number would not be perfectly known if odd and even were unknown. Now universal and singular are differences or proper passions of being. Therefore in God, in knowing His essence, knows perfectly the common nature of being. It follows that He knows perfectly the universal and the singular. But just as He would not know the universal perfectly, if He knew the intention of universality without knowing the thing in the universal, such as man or animal, so too He would not know the singular perfectly, if He knew the nature of singularity without knowing this or that singular thing. Therefore, God must needs know singulars. Again, just as God is His very being, so is He His own act of knowledge, as we have proved. Now from the fact that He is His own being, it follows that in Him are all the perfections of being, as in the first source of being, as we have shown above. Therefore it follows that every perfection of knowledge is found in His knowledge, as in the first fount of knowledge. But this would not be if He were lacking in the knowledge of singulars, since the perfection of some knowers consists in this. Therefore it is impossible for Him not to have knowledge of singulars. Further, In every order of powers, it is universally found that the higher power extends to more things, and yet is but one, whereas the lower power extends to fewer things, and yet is multiple in relation to them. This appears in the imaginative power and sense. For the one power of imagination extends to all the things of which the five senses take cognizance, and to more besides. Now the cognitive power in God is higher than in man. Therefore, whatever man knows by various powers, his intellect namely, imagination, and sense, God considers it by his one simple intellect. Therefore he knows singulars, which we apprehend by sense and imagination. Moreover, God's intellect does not derive its knowledge from things as ours does. Rather is he the cause of things by his knowledge, as we shall prove further on. Wherefore, his knowledge of other things is after the manner of practical knowledge. Now, practical knowledge is not perfect unless it extend to singulars, because the end of practical knowledge is operation, which is about singulars. Therefore, the divine knowledge of other things extends to singulars. Again, the first movable is moved by a motor that moves by intellect and appetite, as was shown above. Now a motor by intellect cannot cause movement unless it knows the movable as naturally inclined to local movement, and that is as existing here and now, and consequently as a singular. Wherefore the intellect, that is the motor of the first movable, knows the first movable as a singular. But this motor is either supposed to be God, and thus our point is proved, or else it is something beneath God. And if the intellect of this motor is able by its own power to know a singular which our intellect is unable to know, much more will the divine intellect be able to do so. Again, the agent is more excellent than the patient and the thing done, as act is more excellent than potentiality. Wherefore a form of lower degree cannot by its action transmit its likeness to a higher degree, whereas a higher form is able by its action to transmit its likeness to a lower degree. Thus corruptible forms are produced in this lower world by the incorruptible agency of the stars, while a corruptible agency cannot produce an incorruptible form. Now all knowledge is the result of assimilation between knower and known. Yet there is this difference, that in human knowledge, assimilation is brought about by the action of sensible things on the human cognitive powers, whereas, contrariwise, in God's knowledge, it arises from the action of the form of the divine intellect on things known. Accordingly, the form of a sensible object, being individualized by its materiality, is unable to transmit the likeness of its singularity to that which is altogether immaterial, and it can only reach those powers which use material organs. But it is transmitted to the intellect by virtue of the active intellect, insofar as it is wholly stripped of material conditions. And so the likeness of the singularity of a sensible form cannot reach as far as the human intellect. On the other hand, the likeness of the form in the divine intellect, since it extends to the smallest details to which his causality extends, reaches to the singularity of a sensible and material form. Therefore, the divine intellect can know singulars, whereas the human intellect cannot. Further, if God knows not singulars which even men know, this would involve the absurdity which the philosopher urges against Empedocles, namely, that God is most foolish. The truth which we have established is confirmed by the authority of Holy Writ, For it is written in Hebrews 4:13, "Neither is there any creature invisible in his sight." The contrary error is rejected in Ecclesiasticus 16:16, "Say not, I shall be hidden from God, and who shall remember me from on high?" From what we have said, it is also clear how the objection raised in the contrary sense does not conclude aright. For that which the divine intellect understands, although immaterial, is nevertheless the likeness of both the matter and the form, as the first productive principle of both. End of chapter 65. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 66 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 66. That God knows the things that are not. In the next place, we must show that God lacks not the knowledge of things that are not. For as stated above, the divine knowledge stands in the same relation to the things known as things knowable to our knowledge. Now the comparison of the thing knowable to our knowledge is that the knowable thing may exist without our having knowledge of it, whereof the philosopher, in the Predicaments, gives the example of squaring the circle, but not conversely. Wherefore, the relation of the divine knowledge to things must be such that it can also relate to non-existent things. Again, the knowledge of God's intellect stands in the same relation to other things as the knowledge of a craftsman to the works of his craft, since he is cause of things by his knowledge. Now the craftsman, by the knowledge of his art, knows even those things which are not yet produced by his art, since the forms of his art pass from his knowledge into external matter so as to produce the works of his art. And consequently, nothing prevents forms which have not yet materialized outwardly from being in the craftsman's knowledge. Therefore nothing prevents God from having knowledge of things that are not. Further, God knows things other than himself by his essence, inasmuch as he is the likeness of the things that proceed from him, as shown above. But since God's essence is infinitely perfect, as proved above, while all things else have limited being and perfection, it is impossible for all other things together to equal the perfection of the divine essence. Wherefore it is capable of representing many things besides those that exist. Hence, if God knows the whole power and perfection of his essence, his knowledge extends not only to those things that are, but also to those that are not. Moreover, our intellect, in respect of the operation by which it knows what a thing is, can have knowledge of those things also that are not actually, since it is able to comprehend the essence of a lion or horse, even if all such animals were slain. Now the divine intellect knows, as one who knows what a thing is, not only definitions, but also enunciations, as shown above. Therefore, it can have knowledge of those things also that are not. Again, an effect can be foreknown in its cause, even before it exists. Even so, an astronomer foreknows a future eclipse by observing the order of the heavenly movements. Now God's knowledge is of all things through their cause, for, by knowing himself, who is the cause of all, he knows other things as his effects, as we proved above. Nothing therefore prevents him from knowing those things also that are not yet. Moreover, there is no succession in God's act of understanding any more than there is in his existence. Hence it is all at once everlasting, which belongs to the essence of eternity, whereas the duration of time is drawn out by the succession of before and after. Wherefore the proportion of eternity to the whole duration of time is as the proportion of the indivisible to the continuous, not indeed of the indivisible that is the term of the continuous, and is not present to each part of the continuous, for such is likened to an instant of time, but of the indivisible that is outside the continuous, and yet synchronizes with each part of the continuous, or with each point of a signet continuous. Because, since time does not exceed movement, eternity, being utterly outside movement, is altogether outside time. Again, since the being of the eternal never fails, eternity synchronizes with every time or instant of time. Somewhat of an example of this may be seen in the circle. For a given point in the circumference, although indivisible, does not coincide in its position with any other point, since the order of position results in the continuity of the circumference, while the center, which is outside the circumference, is directly opposite any given point in the circumference. Accordingly, whatever exists in any part of time is coexistent with the eternal as though present thereto, although in relation to another part of time it is present or future. Now a thing cannot be present to and coexistent with the eternal, except with the whole eternal, since this has no successive duration. Therefore whatever happens throughout the whole course of time is seen as present by the divine intellect in its eternity. And yet that which is done in some part of time was not always in existence. It remains therefore that God has knowledge of those things which are not as yet in relation to the course of time. By these arguments it is made clear that God has knowledge of not beings. Nevertheless, not beings have not at all the same relation to his knowledge. For those things which neither are, nor shall be, nor have been, are known by God as possible to his power. Wherefore he knows them not as existing in themselves in any way, but as merely existing in the divine power. Such things are said by some to be known to God, according to his knowledge of simple intelligence. On the other hand, things which to us are present, past, or future, are known to God as being not only in his power, but also in the respective causes and in themselves. Of such things God is said to have knowledge of vision, because God sees the existence of things which, in relation to us, are not as yet, not only in their causes, but also in themselves, inasmuch as his eternity is by its indivisibility present to all time. Yet God knows every manner of a thing's being by his essence. For his essence is capable of being represented by many things that neither are, nor shall be, nor have been. Moreover, it is the likeness of every cause's power, in respect of which effects pre-exist in their causes. And the being that every single thing has in itself is drawn as a copy from him. Wherefore God knows not beings, insofar as they have being after a fashion, either in the divine power, or in their causes, or in themselves. And this is not contrary to the essential conditions of knowledge. The authority of Holy Writ also bears witness to the foregoing. For it is written in Ecclesiasticus 23:29, "All things were known to the Lord God before they were created. So also after they were perfected, he knoweth all things." And in Jeremiah 1:5, "Before I formed thee in the womb, I knew thee." It is clear from what has been said that we are not compelled to say, as some have said, that God knows all singulars universally, because he knows them in their universal causes only, even as one who knows a particular eclipse, not as this particular one, but as resulting from opposition, since it has been proved that the divine knowledge extends to singulars as existing in themselves. End of chapter 66. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 67 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 67. That God knows future contingent singulars. From the foregoing, it is already somewhat evident that from eternity God has had unerring knowledge of singular contingencies, and that nevertheless they cease not to be contingent. For contingency is not incompatible with certainty of knowledge, except insofar as it is future, and not as it is present. Because a contingency, while future, may not be, so that the knowledge of one who thinks it will be may be wrong, and it will be wrong if what he thinks will be will not be. From the moment, however, that it is, for the time being it cannot not be, although it may not be in the future, but this affects the contingency not as present but as future. Hence, sense loses nothing of its certainty when it sees that a man is running, although this statement is contingent. Accordingly, all knowledge that bears on a contingency as present can be certain. Now the vision of the divine intellect from eternity sees each thing that happens in time as though it were present, as we have shown above. Therefore it follows that nothing prevents God having unerring knowledge of contingencies from eternity. Again, the contingent differs from the necessary, according as each is in its cause. For the contingent is in its cause in such a way that it may not result, or may result therefrom, whereas the necessary cannot but result from its cause. But according as each of them is in itself, they differ not as to being, on which the true is founded, because there is not in the contingent, considered as it is in itself, being and not being, but only being, although it is possible for the contingent not to be in the future. Now the divine intellect knows things from eternity, not only as to the being which they have in their causes, but also as to the being which they have in themselves. Therefore nothing prevents it having eternal and unerring knowledge of contingencies. Moreover, even as the effect follows certainly from a necessary cause, so does it from a complete contingent cause unless it be hindered. Now, since God knows all things, as was proved above, he knows not only the causes of contingencies, but also that which may possibly hinder them. Therefore, he knows certainly whether contingencies be or not. Again, an effect does not happen to exceed its cause, but sometimes it falls short of it. Hence, since in us knowledge is caused from things, it happens at times that we know necessary things by way not of necessity, but of probability. Now, just as with us things are the cause of knowledge, so the divine knowledge is the cause of the things known. Nothing therefore prevents things whereof God has necessary knowledge being contingent in themselves. Further, an effect cannot be necessary if its cause be contingent, for it would follow that an effect exists after its cause has been removed. Now the ultimate effect has both a proximate and a remote cause. Hence, if the proximate cause be contingent, its effect must needs be contingent, even though the remote cause be necessary. Thus plants do not necessarily bear fruit, although the motion of the sun is necessary, on account of the contingent intermediate causes. But God's knowledge, although it is the cause of the things it knows, is nevertheless the remote cause. Wherefore the contingency of the things it knows does not militate with its necessity, since it happens that the intermediate causes are contingent. Again, God's knowledge would not be true and perfect if things happened not in the same way as God knows them to happen. Now God, since he is cognizant of all being, whereof he is the source, knows each effect not only in itself, but also in its relation to every one of its causes. But the relation of the contingencies to their proximate causes is that they result from them contingently. Therefore God knows that certain things happen, and that they happen contingently. Wherefore the certainty and truth of the divine knowledge do not take away the contingency of things. It is therefore clear from what has been said how we are to refute the objection gainsaying God's knowledge of contingencies. For change in that which is subsequent does not argue changeableness in that which precedes, since it happens that contingent ultimate effects result from necessary first causes. Now the things known to God do not precede his knowledge, as is the case with us, but are subsequent thereto. Therefore it does not follow that, if what is known to God to be changeable, his knowledge can err or in any way be changeable. It will therefore be a fallacy of consequence if, because our knowledge of changeable things is changeable, we think that this happens in all knowledge. Again, when we say God knows, or knew this future thing, we imply a kind of middle term between the divine knowledge and the thing known, namely the time at which the statement is made, in relation to which that which God is said to know its future. But it is not future in relation to the divine knowledge, which, existing in the moment of eternity, is related to all things as though they were present. In relation to that knowledge, if we set aside the time at which the statement is made, there is no saying that the thing is known as non-existent, so as to allow of the question being raised as to whether it is possible for the thing not to be. But it will be said to be known by God as already seen in its existence. This being supposed, there is no room for the aforesaid question, since what is already cannot, as regards that instant, not be. The fallacy arises, then, from the fact that the time at which we speak is coexistent with eternity, as also does past time, which is designated when we say, God knew. Wherefore the relation of past or present to future time is ascribed to eternity, which is altogether inapplicable thereto. The result is a fallacy of accident. Further, if every single thing is known to God as seen present to him, that which God knows will be so far necessary, as it is necessary that Socrates is sitting from the fact that he is seen to be sitting. Now this is necessary, not absolutely, or as some say by necessity of consequent, but conditionally, or by necessity of consequence. For this conditional statement is necessary. If he is seen to sit, he sits. Wherefore, if the conditional be rendered categorically, so as to run, that which is seen to sit necessarily sits, it is clear that if it be referred to the statement, and in a composite sense it is true, and if referred to the thing and in a divided sense, it is false. And so in these and in all like arguments employed by those who gainsay God's knowledge of contingencies, there is a fallacy of composition and division. That God knows future contingencies is also proved by the authority of Holy Writ. For it is said in Wisdom chapter 8 verse 8 about the divine wisdom, she knoweth signs and wonders before they be done, and the events of time and ages. And in Ecclesiasticus 39 verses 24 and 25, there is nothing hid from his eyes, he seeth from eternity to eternity. And in Isaiah 48:5, I foretold thee of old, before they came to pass, I told thee. End of chapter 67. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 68 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 68. That God knows the movements of the will. In the next place, we must show that God knows our mind's thoughts and our secret wills. For everything, in whatever way it exists, is known by God inasmuch as he knows his essence, as we have shown above. Now some things are in the soul, and some in things outside the soul. Wherefore God knows all these differences of things, and whatever is contained under them. Now the things in the soul are those that are in our will or our thought. It remains, therefore, that God knows what we have in our thoughts and wills. Moreover, God so knows other things in knowing his essence, as effects are known through their cause being known. Accordingly, by knowing his essence, God knows all the things to which his causality extends. Now this extends to the works of the intellect and will. For since everything acts by its form, which gives the thing some kind of being, it follows that the highest source of all being, from which also every form is derived, must be the source of all operation, because the effects of second causes are to be referred in a still higher degree to first causes. Therefore, God knows both the thoughts and the affections of the mind. Again, even as his being is first, and consequently the cause of all being, so his act of intelligence is first, and consequently the cause of all intellectual operation. Wherefore, just as God, by knowing his being, knows the being of everything, so by knowing his act of intelligence and will, he knows every thought and will. Further, God knows things not only as existing in themselves, but also as existing in their causes, as proved above. For he knows the relation between cause and effect. Now the products of art are in the craftsman through the intellect and will of the craftsman, even as natural things are in their causes through the powers of the causes. For, just as natural things liken their effects to themselves by their active powers, so the craftsman by his intellect gives his handiwork the form whereby it is likened to his art. It is the same with all things done of set purpose. Therefore God knows both our thoughts and our wills. Again, intelligible substances are no less known to God than sensible substances are known to him or to us, since intelligible substances are more knowable, forasmuch as they are more actual. Now the informations and inclinations of sensible substances are known both to God and to us. Consequently, since the soul's thought results from its being informed, and since its affection is its inclination towards something, for even the inclination of a natural thing is called its natural appetite, it follows that God knows our secret thoughts and affections. This is confirmed by the testimony of Holy Writ. For it is said in the Psalm, "The searcher of hearts and reins is God." And in Proverbs 15:11, "Hell and destruction are before the Lord, how much more the hearts of the children of men. And in John 2:25, he knew what was in man. The dominion which the will exercises over its own acts, and by which it is in its power to will and not to will, removes the determination of the power to one thing, and the violence of a cause acting from without. But it does not exclude the influence of a higher cause from which it has being and action. Thus, causality remains in the first cause, which is God, in respect of the movements of the will, so that God is able to know them by knowing himself. End of chapter 68. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 69 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 69. That God knows infinite things. We must next prove that God knows infinite things. For in knowing that he is the cause of things, he knows things other than himself, as was shown above. Now he is the cause of infinite things, if there be infinite things, since he is the cause of whatever is. Therefore, he knows infinite things. Again, God knows his own power perfectly, as was proved above. Now a power cannot be known perfectly unless all the things to which it extends be known, since its quantity is gauged in a manner according to them. But his power, being infinite, as we have shown, extends to infinite things. Therefore, God knows infinite things. Moreover, if God's knowledge extends to all things that exist, in whatever way they exist, as we have shown, it follows that he knows not only actual being, but also potential being. Now in natural things, there is the infinite potentiality, although not actually. Now in natural things, there is the infinite potentially, although not actually, as the philosopher proves in the third book of Physics. Therefore God knows infinite things, even as unity, which is the principle of number, would know infinite species of numbers if it knew whatever is potentially in it. For unity is every number potentially. Again, God knows other things in his essence, as in a prototypical medium. Now since he is infinitely perfect, as was shown above, it is possible for an infinite number of things with finite perfections to be copied from him, since it is impossible for any single one, or any number of copies, to equal the example of their prototype, and thus there always remains some new way in which some copy can imitate it. Nothing therefore prevents him from knowing infinite things by his essence. Further, God's being is his act of understanding. Therefore, even as his being is infinite, as shown above, so his act of understanding is infinite. Now as finite is to finite, so is infinite to infinite. If therefore by our act of understanding, which is finite, we are able to understand finite things, God also by his act of understanding is able to understand infinite things. Moreover, according to the philosopher in the third book of De Anima, an intellect which knows the supremely intelligible knows the less intelligible not less but more. And the reason for this is that the intellect is not corrupted by the excellence of the intelligible as the sense is, but is the more perfected. Now if we take an infinite number of beings, whether they be of the same species, as an infinite number of men, or of an infinite number of species, even though some or all of them be infinite in quantity, if this were possible, all of them together would be of less infinity than God, since each one and all together would have being confined and limited to a certain species or genus, and thus would be in some way finite, wherefore it would fall short from the infinity of God, who is infinite simply, as we proved above. Since, therefore, God knows himself perfectly, nothing prevents him from also knowing that infinite number of things. Further, the more efficacious and clear an intellect is in knowing, the greater the number of things it is able to know from one, even as every power, the stronger it is, the more united it is. Now the divine intellect is infinite in efficacy or perfection, as was shown above. Therefore, it can know an infinite number of things by one which is his essence. Further, the divine intellect, like the divine essence, is perfect simply. Wherefore, no intellectual perfection is lacking thereto. Now that to which our intellect is in potentiality is its intellectual perfection, and it is in potentiality to all intelligible species. But these species are infinite in number, since the species of numbers and figures are infinite. It follows, therefore, that God knows all like infinite things. Again, since our intellect is cognizant of the infinite in potentiality, forasmuch as it is able to multiply the species of numbers indefinitely, if the divine intellect knew not also the infinite in act, it would follow either that our intellect knows more things than the divine intellect knows, or that the divine intellect knows not actually all things that it knows potentially, and each of these is impossible, as proved above. Further, the infinite is repugnant to knowledge insofar as it is incompatible with being counted, for it is in itself impossible, as implying a contradiction, for the parts of the infinite to be numbered. Now the knowledge of a thing by counting its parts belongs to an intellect that knows one part after another in succession, and not to one that understands the various parts together. Since then the divine intellect knows things together without succession, it is no more hindered from knowing the infinite than from knowing the finite. Moreover, all quantity consists in a certain plurality of parts, for which reason number is the first of quantities. Accordingly, where plurality involves no difference, neither does it cause any difference consequent upon quantity. Now in God's knowledge many things are known in the same way as one, since they are known not by various species, but by one which is God's essence. Wherefore, many things are known by God simultaneously, and consequently, plurality makes no difference in God's knowledge. Neither therefore does the infinite which is consequent upon quantity. Therefore knowledge, whether of infinite or of finite things, differs not to the divine intellect, and consequently, since it knows finite things, nothing prevents it from knowing also infinite things. The words of the psalm are in agreement with this, and of his wisdom there is no number. From the foregoing it is clear why our intellect knows not the infinite as the divine intellect does. For our intellect differs from the divine intellect in 4 respects, which constitute this difference. In the first place, our intellect is simply finite, whereas the divine intellect is infinite. Secondly, our intellect knows different things by different species, wherefore it cannot grasp infinite things by one knowledge as the divine intellect can. The third difference results from the fact that our intellect, since it knows different things by different species, cannot know many things at the same time, so that it cannot know an infinite number of things except by taking them one after the other. Whereas it is not so in the divine intellect, which considers many things simultaneously, as seen by one species. Fourthly, because the divine intellect is about things that are and things that are not, as we proved above. It is also clear how the saying of the philosopher that the infinite as such is unknown is not in contradiction with this statement. For since, as he says, the notion of infinity is becoming to quantity, the infinite would be known as such if it were known by the measuring of its parts, because this is proper knowledge of quantity. But God does not know thus. Wherefore, so to say, he knows the infinite, not as such, but inasmuch as in comparison with his knowledge it is finite, as we have shown. It must be observed, however, that God does not know infinite things by his knowledge of vision, to use the expression employed by others, because the infinite neither is, nor was, nor will be actual, since, according to the Catholic faith, generation is not infinite on either part. Yet he knows the infinite by his knowledge of simple intelligence. For God knows the infinite number of things that neither are, nor will be, nor have been, and nevertheless are in the power of a creature. He knows also the infinite things that are in his power, that neither are, nor have been, nor shall be. Wherefore, as regards the question about the knowledge of singulars, we might reply by denying the major premise, since singulars are not infinite. If, however, they were, God would know them nonetheless. End of chapter 69. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 70 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 70. That God knows trivial things. This being established, we must show that God knows trivial things, and that this is not inconsistent with the nobility of his knowledge. For the stronger an active power is, the further does its action extend, as appears even in the action of sensible things. Now the force of the divine intellect in knowing things is likened to an active power, since the divine intellect knows not by receiving from things, but rather by pouring itself into them. Since then, it is of infinite power in understanding, as shown above, it follows that its knowledge extends to the most remote things. Now the degrees of nobility and meanness in all beings depend on nearness to and distance from God, who is in the summit of nobility. Therefore God, on account of the exceeding power of his intellect, knows things even though they be in the last degree trivial. Further, whatever is, for as much as it exists, or is such, is actual, and a likeness of the first act, and for this reason has nobility. Again, whatever is in potentiality has a share of nobility through its being ordained to actuality. For so is it said to be. It follows, therefore, that everything considered in itself is noble, but is said to be mean in comparison with that which is more noble. Now the noblest of things other than God are no less distant from him than the lowest creatures are from the highest. If, therefore, this latter distance hindered God's knowledge, much more would the former, and thus it would follow that God knows nothing other than himself, which has been disproved above. If, therefore, he knows something other than himself, however most noble it may be, for the same reason he knows everything, no matter how mean we call it. Moreover, the good of the order in the universe is more noble than any part of the universe, because each part is directed to the good of the order and the whole as to its end, as the philosopher states in the 11th book of Metaphysics. If then God knows some other noble nature, most of all must he know the order of the universe. But this cannot be known unless both noble and mean things be known, because the order of the universe consists in their mutual distances and relationships. It follows, therefore, that God knows not only noble things, but also those that are deemed trivial. Further, the meanness of things known does not of itself reflect on the knower, for it belongs to the nature of knowledge that the knower contains the species of the things he knows, according to his mode. And yet the meanness of things known may reflect accidentally on the knower, either because while considering mean things he is withdrawn from the thought of noble things, or because through considering mean things he is inclined to certain undue affections. But this cannot take place in God, as appears from what has been said. Therefore, the knowledge of trivial things is not derogatory to the nobility of God. Rather does it belong to his perfection, forasmuch as he prepossesses all things in himself, as we have shown above. Again, a power is accounted little, not through being capable of little things, but through being confined to little results. Since a power that is capable of great things is also capable of little ones. Accordingly, knowledge that comprises both noble and trivial things is not to be accounted trivial, but only that which comprises none but trivial things, as happens with us. For our thoughts of divine things are distinct from our thoughts of human things, and of each we have a distinct knowledge. Wherefore, in comparison with the more noble, the less noble is accounted mean. But it is not thus in God, because he considers all things with the same thought and knowledge. Therefore, no meanness is to be ascribed to his knowledge on account of his knowing any mean things whatever. In accord with this is the saying of Wisdom, chapter 7, verses 24 and 5, about divine wisdom, that she reacheth everywhere by reason of her purity, and no defiled thing cometh into her. It is clear from what has been said that the argument put forward in opposition is not subversive of the truth we have demonstrated. For the nobility of a science depends on the principal object of that science, and not on whatever may come under that science, because with us not only the highest, but also the lowest beings come under the most noble of sciences. For the treatise of metaphysics extends from the first being to potential being, which is the lowest of all beings. Thus, then, the divine knowledge comprises the lowest beings as being known at the same time with the object known principally, for the divine essence is the principal object of God's knowledge, and in it he knows all things, as we have shown above. It is also evident that this truth is not in contradiction with the statements of the philosopher in the 11th book of Metaphysics. For there he intends to prove that the divine intellect knows not something other than himself, that is a perfection of his intellect, as the principal object of its knowledge. And in this sense he states that it is better not to know mean things than to know them, when, that is, knowledge of trivial things is distinct from the knowledge of noble things, and the thought of mean things is an obstacle to the thought of noble things. End of chapter 70. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 71 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 71. That God knows evil things. It remains now to be proved that God knows evil things. For if a good be known, the opposite evil is known. Now God knows all the particular goods to which evils are opposed. Therefore, God knows evil things. Further, the notions of contraries in the mind are not opposed to one another, else they would not be together in the mind, nor would they be known at the same time. Therefore the aspect under which we know evil is not repugnant to good, rather is it connected with the idea of good. Accordingly, if, as we have proved above, all the aspects of goodness are to be found in God by reason of his absolute perfection, it follows that in him is the notion by which evil is known. Therefore, he knows evils also. Again, the true is the good of the intellect. For an intellect is said to be good forasmuch as it knows the true. Now, it is not only true that good is good, but also that evil is evil. For just as it is true that what is, so is it true that what is not. Hence the good of the intellect consists even in the knowledge of evil. But since the divine intellect is perfect in goodness, it cannot possibly lack any intellectual perfection. Therefore, it has the knowledge of evils. Moreover, God knows the distinction between things as shown above. Now the notion of distinction includes negation, for when things are distinct, the one is not the other. Hence primaries, which are distinguished by themselves, include mutual negation of one another, as for this reason negative propositions about them are self-evident. For instance, no quantity is a substance. Therefore God knows negation. Now privation is negation in a definite subject, as is proved in the fourth book of Metaphysics. Therefore he knows privation, and consequently evil, which is nothing else than the privation of due perfection. Further, if God knows all the species of things, as was proved above, and as granted and proved even by some philosophers, it follows that he knows contraries, both because the species of certain genera are contrary, and because the differences of genera are contrary, as stated in the 10th book of Metaphysics. Now contraries include opposition of form and of privation, according to the same authority. Therefore it follows that God knows privation and, consequently, evil. Again, God knows not only form, but also matter, as was proved above. Now matter, since it is being in potentiality, cannot be known perfectly unless it be known to what its potentiality extends, and this applies to all kinds of power. But the potentiality of matter extends to both form and privation, for that which can be can also not be. Therefore God knows privation, and consequently he knows evil. Again, if God knows anything besides himself, most of all he knows that which is best. And this is the order of the universe, to which as their end all particular goods are directed. Now, in the order of the universe, there are certain things intended for the removal of harms that might result from certain other things, as evidenced by the means of defense with which animals are provided. Therefore God knows these harms, and thus he knows evils. Further, we are never blamed for knowing evils as regards that which belongs essentially to knowledge, that is, as regards judgment about evil, but only accidentally, forasmuch as sometimes one is inclined to evil through thinking about it. But it is not so in God, for he is unchangeable, as was proved above. Nothing therefore hinders God from knowing evils. In agreement with this, it is written, in Wisdom chapter 8, that no evil can overcome God's wisdom, and in Proverbs 15:11 that hell and destruction are before the Lord. Also in the Psalm it is said, my offenses are not hidden from thee. And in Job 11:11, for he knoweth the vanity of men, and when he seeth iniquity, doth he not consider it? It must, however, be observed that with regard to the knowledge of evil and privation, there is a difference between the divine intellect and ours. For seeing that our intellect knows each thing by its respective proper and distinct species, it knows that which is in act by an intelligible species, whereby the intellect is made actual. Hence it is able to know potentiality, inasmuch as it is sometimes in potentiality to such a species. And thus, just as it knows act by means of an act, so it knows potentiality by means of potentiality. And since potentiality belongs to the notion of privation, for privation is a negation of the subject whereof is a being in potentiality, it follows that it is becoming to our intellect to know privation in some way, inasmuch as it is naturally fitted to be in potentiality. Although we may also say that the mere knowledge of actuality leads to the knowledge of potentiality and privation. On the other hand, the divine intellect, which is nowise in potentiality, knows neither privation nor anything else in the above manner. For if he knew anything by a species other than himself, it would follow of necessity that he is compared to that species as potentiality to act. It follows therefore that he understands only by a species that is his essence, and consequently that he understands himself as the first object of his understanding. And yet, in understanding himself, he understands other things, as shown above, and not only acts, but potentialities and privations. This is what the philosopher means when he says, in the third book of De Anima, how does it know evil or black? For it knows contraries somewhat, and it must know them by a potentiality that is in itself. But if anything there be in which the contrary is not, namely in potentiality, it knows itself, and is in act and separable. Nor is it necessary to admit the explanation of Averroes, who maintains that it follows from the above that the intellect which is pure act knows a privation not at all. But the sense is that it knows privation not through being in potentiality to something else, but through knowing itself and being always in act. Again, it must be observed that if God knew himself in such a way that by knowing himself he knew not other beings which are particular goods, he would have no knowledge whatever of privation or evil. Because there is no privation contrary to the good that is himself, since a privation and its contrary are naturally adapted to be in relation to the same thing, and so no privation, and therefore no evil, is opposed to that which is pure act. Wherefore, supposing God to know himself alone, he would not know evil through knowing the good which is himself. But, since by knowing himself he knows things in which there is a natural aptness for privations, it follows of necessity that he knows the opposite privation and the evils contrary to particular goods. It must also be observed that, just as God by knowing himself knows other things without any discursion of his intellect, as shown above, so too there is no need for his knowledge to be discursive, if he knows evil through good. For good is the ratio, as it were, of the knowledge of evil, so that evil is known through good as a thing through its definition, and not as conclusions through their premises. Nor does it argue imperfection in the divine knowledge, if God knows evil through the privation of good, because evil does not indicate being except insofar as it is a privation of good. Wherefore in this way alone is it knowable, since a thing is so far knowable as it has being. End of chapter 71. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 72 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 72. That in God there is will. After discussing the matters concerning the knowledge of the divine intellect, it remains for us to consider the divine will. For from the fact that there is intelligence in God, it follows that in him there is will. Because, since the good understood is the proper object of the will, it follows that the good understood, as such, is willed. Now, understood indicates a reference to one who understands. It follows, therefore, of necessity, that one who understands good, as such, has a will. Now God understands good, for since he is perfectly intelligent, as shown above, he understands being simultaneously with the notion of good. Therefore, in him there is will. Again, whatever has a form is thereby related to things actually existing. Thus white timber, by its whiteness, is like some things and unlike others. Now, in intelligent and sentient subjects, there is the form of the thing understood and sensed, because all knowledge is through some likeness. Therefore, there must be a relation in the intelligent or sentient subject to the things understood or sensed, according as the latter actually exist. Now this is not due to the fact that they understand or sense, because in this respect rather is there a relation in things to the intelligent or sentient subject, since intelligence and sensation depend on things being in the intellect and sense, according to the respective modes of each. But the sentient and the intelligent subject have by the will and appetite a relation to things outside the mind. Wherefore every sentient and intelligent subject has an appetite and will, although properly speaking, will is in an intellect. Since then God is intelligent, it follows that he has a will. Moreover, that which is consequent upon every being belongs to being as such, and a thing of this kind must needs be found especially in that which is the first being. Now, it is competent to every being to desire its own perfection and the preservation of its being, and to each one this is competent according to its mode, to intelligent beings by will, to animals by sensitive appetite, to those that are devoid of sense by natural appetite, to those, however, who have it otherwise than to those who have it not. For those who have it not, by the appetitive power of their genus, tend with desire to acquire what is lacking to them, whereas those who have it are at rest therein. Wherefore, this cannot be lacking to the first being, which is God. Since, then, he is intelligent, there is will in him, whereby his being and his goodness are pleasing to him. Again, the more perfect the act of understanding is, the more delightful is it to the one who understands. Now God understands, and his act of understanding is most perfect, as was proved above. Therefore to understand is to him most delightful. But intellectual delight is by the will, even as sensitive delight is by the appetite of concupiscence. Therefore there is will in God. Further, a form considered by the intellect neither moves nor causes anything, except through the medium of the will, whose object is an end and a good by which one is moved to act. Wherefore, the speculative intellect does not move, nor does the sole imagination without the estimative power. Now the form of the divine intellect is the cause of being and movement in other things, for God moves things by his intellect, as we shall prove further on. Therefore it follows that he has a will. Again, the first of motive powers in intelligent beings is the will, because the will applies every power to its act. For we understand because we will, we imagine because we will, and so forth. And the will has this because its object is the end, although the intellect, not by way of efficient and moving cause, but by way of final cause, moves the will by putting its object before it, which object is the end. Therefore, it is especially fitting that the first mover should have a will. Further, the free is that which is its own cause, and so the free has the aspect of that which is of itself. Now liberty of action is seated primarily in the will, for insofar as one acts voluntarily, one is said to perform any action whatever freely. Therefore, it is especially fitting that the first agent should act by will, since to him it is most competent to act of himself. Moreover, the end and the agent intending the end are always of the same order in things. Wherefore, the proximate end, which is proportionate to the agent, is of the same species as the agent, in works both of nature and of art. For the form of the art whereby the craftsman works is the species of the form that is in matter, and is the end of the craftsman. And the form of the generating fire whereby the fire acts is of the same species as the form of the fire generated, which form is the end of the generation. Now nothing is coordinate with God as though it were of the same order, except God himself. Otherwise, there would be several first beings, and we have shown the contrary to be the case. He is therefore the first agent intending an end, which is himself. Therefore, he not only is a desirable end, but also desires himself, so to speak, as an end. And, since he is intelligent, he desires himself by intellectual appetite, and this is will. Therefore, in God there is will. Holy Writ bears witness to this will of God, for it is said in the Psalm, "Whatsoever the Lord willed, he hath done," and in Romans 9:19, who resisteth his will. End of chapter 72. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 73 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 73. That God's will is His essence. It is evident from the foregoing that His will is not distinct from His essence. For it belongs to God to have a will inasmuch as He has an intellect, as proved above. Now He is intelligent by His essence, as we have already shown, and consequently will also is in Him by His essence. Therefore, God's will is His very essence. Again, even as to understand is the perfection of one who is intelligent, so to will is the perfection of one who wills. For each is an action abiding in the agent, and not passing into something passive as heating. Now God's act of intelligence is His being, as we proved above. Because, since God's being is by itself supremely perfect, it admits of no additional perfection, as we have shown above. Therefore, the divine willing is also His being, and consequently God's will is His essence. Moreover, since every agent acts in so far as it is actual, it follows that God, who is pure act, acts by His essence. Now willing is an operation of God. Therefore it follows that God wills by His essence. Therefore His will is His essence. Again, if will were something added to the divine substance, since the divine substance is complete in being, it would follow that will would be adventitious to Him like an accident to its subject, that the divine substance would be compared thereto as potentiality to act, and that there is composition in God, all of which have been disproved above. It is therefore impossible for the divine will to be something in addition to the divine essence. End of chapter 73. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 74 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 74. That the principal object of God's will is the divine essence. It is also evident from the foregoing that the principal object of God's will is His essence. For the good, understood, is the object of the will, as proved above. Now the principal object of God's intellect is the divine essence, as we have already proved. Therefore, the divine essence is the principal object of the divine will. Again, the appetible object is compared to the appetite as mover to the thing moved, as we have stated above. It is the same with the thing willed in relation to the will, since the will belongs to the genus of appetitive powers. Wherefore, if something besides God's essence were the principal object of God's will, it would follow that something else is superior to and moves the divine will, and the contrary of this was proved above. Further, the principal thing willed is to every willer the cause of his willing. For when we say, "I wish to walk that I may be healed," we consider that we are stating the reason, and if it be asked, "Why do you wish to be healed?" we shall continue to give reasons until we come to the last end, which is the principal thing willed, and is of itself the cause of willing. Accordingly, if God wills principally something other than himself, it follows that something other than himself is the cause of his willing. But his willing is his being, as we have shown. Therefore something else will be the cause of his being, and this is contrary to the notion of the first being. Again, to every willer, the thing willed principally is his last end, because the end is willed by reason of itself, and other things come to be willed by reason of it. Now God is the last end, because he is the sovereign good, as was proved. Therefore, he is the principal object of his will. Moreover, every power is proportionate to its principal object according to equality. For the power of a thing is measured according to its object, as the philosopher says, in the first book of Caeli et Mundi. Therefore, the will is proportionate according to equality to its principal object, as well as the intellect and the senses. Now nothing is proportionate according to equality to God's will, except his essence. Therefore the principal object of the divine will is the divine essence. And since the divine essence is God's act of understanding, and whatsoever else is said to be in God, it is also clear that in the same way, God wills principally, to will, to understand, to be one, and so forth. End of chapter 74. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 75 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 75. That God, in willing himself, wills also other things. Hence it may be proved that in willing himself, he wills other things also. For he who wills the end principally, wills the means to the end for the sake of that end. Now God himself is the last end of things, as appears sufficiently from what we have said. From the fact, therefore, that he wills himself to be, he wills also other things that are directed to himself as their end. Again, everything desires the perfection of that which it wills and loves for its own sake, because whatever we love for its own sake, we wish to be best, and ever to be bettered and multiplied as much as possible. Now God wills and loves his essence for its own sake, and it cannot be increased or multiplied in itself, as appears from what has been said, and can only be multiplied in respect of its likeness, which is shared by many. Therefore God wishes things to be multiplied, because he wills and loves his essence and perfection. Moreover, whosoever loves a thing in itself, and for its own sake, loves in consequence all the things wherein it is found. Thus, he who loves sweetness for its own sake must needs love all sweet things. Now God wills and loves his own being, in itself and for its own sake, as we have proved above. And all other being is a participation, by likeness, of his being, as was made sufficiently clear by what we have said above. Therefore, from the very fact that God wills and loves himself, it follows that he wills and loves other things. Again, God, in willing himself, wills all things that are in him. Now all things pre-exist in him somewhat by their proper types, as we have proved. Therefore, in willing himself, God wills other things. Again, as stated above, the greater a thing's power, to so many more things, and to the greater distance does its causality extend. Now the causality of an end consists in other things being desired for its sake. Wherefore, the more perfect and the more willed an end is, to so many more things does the will of him who wills that end extend by reason of that end. But the divine essence is most perfect, considered under the aspect of goodness and end. Therefore, it will extend its causality most of all to many things, so that many be willed for its sake, especially by God, who wills it perfectly with all his might. Further, will is consequent upon intellect. Now God, by his intellect, understands himself principally, and other things in himself. Therefore, in like manner he wills himself principally, and in willing himself he wills all else. This is confirmed by the authority of Holy Writ, for it is written in Wisdom 11:25, "For thou lovest all things that are, and hatest none of the things which thou hast made." End of chapter 75. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 76 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 76. That God, by the one act of his will, wills himself and other things. This being proved, it follows that God, by one act of his will, wills himself and other things. For every power tends by one operation or act to its object, and the formal aspect of that object, even as by the one sight we see light and color made visible by light. Now when we will something solely for the sake of an end, that which is desired for the sake of the end takes its aspect of the thing willed from the end, and thus the end is compared to it as the formal aspect to an object, as light to color. Since, then, God wills all things for his own sake, as for the sake of an end, as we have proved, he wills himself and other things by one act of his will. Moreover, that which is perfectly known and desired is known and desired with respect to its whole virtue. Now the virtue of an end consists not only in its being desired for its own sake, but also in other things being made desirable for its sake. Wherefore, he that desires an end perfectly, desires it in both these ways. But it cannot be admitted that God has an act whereby he wills himself without willing himself perfectly, since in him there is nothing imperfect. Hence by every act in which God wills himself, he wills himself absolutely, and other things for his own sake. And he wills not things other than himself, except because he wills himself, as was proved above. It follows, therefore, that not by distinct acts, but by one and the same act, he wills himself and other things. Again, as appears from what has been said, discursion in the act of the cognitive faculty occurs when we know the premises apart from the conclusions, and draw the conclusions from them. For if we were to see the conclusions in the premises themselves simply through knowing the premises, there would be no discursion, as neither is there when we see something reflected in a mirror. Now just as the premises are related to the conclusions in speculative matters, so are the ends to the means in practical and appetitive matters. Because even as we know conclusions through their premises, so does the end lead us to the appetite and practice of the means. Accordingly, if a person will the end and the means separately, there will be discursion in his will. but there can be no such thing in God, since he is outside all movement. Therefore, it follows that God wills himself and other things simultaneously by the one same act of his will. Again, since God always wills himself, if he will himself by one, and other things by another act, it follows that there are two acts of will in him at the same time. But this is impossible, since of one simple power there are not at the one time two operations. Further, in every act of the will, the thing willed is compared to the will as mover to moved. Wherefore, if there be an act of the divine will, by which he wills things other than himself, and which is distinct from the act whereby he wills himself, there will be in him something else that moves the divine will, and this is impossible. Moreover, God's willing is his being, as we have proved. But in God there is only one being. Therefore, in him there is but one act of the will. Again, it is becoming to God to will inasmuch as he is intelligent. Wherefore, just as by one act he understands himself and other things, inasmuch as his essence is the exemplar of all things, so by one act he wills himself and other things, inasmuch as his goodness is the type of all goodness. End of chapter 76. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 77 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 77. That the multitude of things willed is not inconsistent with the divine simplicity. Hence it follows that the multitude of things willed is not inconsistent with the oneness and simplicity of the divine substance. For acts are distinguished according to their objects. If, then, the plurality of things willed by God indicated any kind of multitude in him, it would follow that there is not only one operation of the will in him, and this is contrary to what has been proved. Again, it has been shown that God wills other things inasmuch as he wills his goodness. Wherefore, things stand in relation to his will, forasmuch as they are comprised in his goodness. Now all things are one in his goodness, because other things are in him according to his mode, to wit, material things immaterially, and multitude unitedly, as we have shown above. Hence it follows that the plurality of things willed does not argue plurality in the divine substance. Further, the divine intellect and will are of equal simplicity, since each is the divine substance, as we have proved. Now the multitude of things understood does not involve multiplicity in the divine essence, nor composition in his intellect. Neither therefore does the multitude of things willed prove either diversity in the divine essence, or composition in his will. Moreover, the difference between knowledge and appetite is, that knowledge results from the thing known being somehow in the knower, whereas appetite does not, but on the contrary, results from the appetite being referred to the appetible thing, which the appetent seeks and wherein it rests. For this reason, good and evil which regard the appetite are in things, whereas true and false which regard knowledge are in the mind, as the philosopher states in the 6th book of Metaphysics. Now, it is not inconsistent with the simplicity of a thing that it be referred to many, since even unity is the principle of the multitude of numbers. Therefore, the multitude of things willed by God is not inconsistent with his simplicity. End of chapter 77. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 78 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 78. That the divine will extends to particular goods. It is also evident from the foregoing that in order to safeguard the divine simplicity, it is not necessary for us to say that God wills other goods in a kind of universal way, insofar as he wills himself to be the source of the goods which can flow from him, and that he does not will them in particular. For the act of willing is according to a comparison of the willer to the thing willed. Now the divine simplicity does not forbid God's being compared to many things, even to particulars, for he is said to be best or first, even in comparison with singulars. Therefore his simplicity is not inconsistent with his willing things other than himself, even in special or in particular. Again, God's will is compared to other things inasmuch as they partake of his goodness through being ordered to the divine goodness, which is to God the reason of his willing. Now not only the universe of good things, but also each one of them derives its goodness, as also its being, from the goodness of God. Therefore God's will extends to each single good. Moreover, according to the philosopher in the 11th book of Metaphysics, there is a twofold good of order in the universe, one consisting in the whole universe being directed to that which is outside the universe, just as the army is directed to the commander-in-chief, while the other consists in the parts of the universe being directed to each other, as the parts of an army. And the second order is for the sake of the first. Now God, through willing himself as end, wills other things that are directed to him as their end, as we have proved. Therefore, he wills the good of the order of the whole universe in relation to himself, and the order of the universe as regards the mutual relation of its parts. Now the good of order arises from each single good. Therefore he wills also singular goods. Further, if God wills not the singular goods of which the universe consists, it follows that the good of order is in the universe by chance. For it is not possible that some one part of the universe arranges all the particular goods so as to produce the order of the universe. And only the universal cause of the whole universe can do this, which cause is God, who acts by his will, as we shall prove further on. But it is impossible for the order of the universe to result from chance, since it would follow a fortiori that other things which come afterwards are the result of chance. Therefore it follows that God wills even each particular good. Again, the good understood as such is the object of the will. But God understands also particular goods, as we have proved. Therefore he also wills particular goods. This is confirmed by the authority of Scripture, which sets forth, in the first chapter of Genesis, the pleasure of the divine will in each work in the words, God saw the light that it was good, and in like manner as to each work, and afterwards in reference to all the works. God saw all that he had made, and they were very good. End of chapter 78. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 79 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 79. That God wills even the things that are not yet. Now if the act of willing is by comparison of the willer to the thing willed, someone might think that God wills only the things that are, since relatives must needs be simultaneous, and if one cease, the other ceases, as the philosopher teaches. Wherefore, if the act of willing is by comparison of the willer to the thing willed, no one can will other things than those which are. Moreover, will relates to things willed, even as cause and creator. Now not even God can be called creator, or Lord, or Father, except of the things that are. Neither therefore can he be said to will other things than those which are. One might conclude further, if God's willing is unchangeable, just as the divine being, and if he wills nothing but what actually is, that he wills nothing but what always is. To these arguments some answer that things which are not in themselves are in God and in his intellect. Wherefore nothing prevents God willing things even which are not in themselves, insofar as they are in him. This reply, however, is seemingly insufficient. For every willer is said to will a thing insofar as his will is referred to the thing willed. Wherefore, if the divine will is not referred to a thing willed, that is not except insofar as it is in God or in his intellect, it would follow that God wills it merely because he wills it to be in himself or in his intellect. Yet those who make the above statements do not mean this, but that God wills things which as yet are not to be also in themselves. Again, if the will be referred to the thing willed through its object, which is a good understood, the intellect understands that the good is not only in the intellect itself, but also in its own nature, and the will must be referred to the thing willed not only as it is in the knower, but also as it is in itself. Accordingly, we must say that, since the apprehended good moves the will, the act of willing must needs follow the condition of the apprehender, even as the movements of the other movables follow the condition of the mover, which is the cause of the movement. Now the relation of the apprehender to the thing apprehended is consequent upon the apprehension, because the apprehender is referred to the thing apprehended through its apprehension thereof. Now the apprehender apprehends the thing not only as it is in the apprehender, but also as it is in its proper nature. For we not only know that a thing is understood by us, which is the same as the thing being in our intellect, but also that it is, or has been, or will be, in its proper nature. Wherefore, although the thing is then only in the knower, yet the relation consequent upon the apprehension is referred thereto, not as it is known in the knower, but as it is in its proper nature which the apprehender apprehends. Accordingly, the relation of the divine will is to a non-existent thing, as it is in its proper nature in reference to a certain time, and not only as in God knowing it. Therefore, God wills the thing that is not now to be in reference to a certain time, and he does not will merely to understand it. Nor does the comparison hold with the relation of willer to thing willed, nor of creator to creature, nor of maker to thing made, nor of lord to the creature subject to him. For to will is an act abiding in the willer, wherefore it does not necessarily imply anything existing outside. But to make, to create, and to govern denote an action terminating in an external effect, without the existence of which such an action is inconceivable. End of chapter 79. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 80 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 80. That God necessarily wills His being and His goodness. From what has been proved above, it follows that God wills necessarily His being and His goodness, and that He cannot will the contrary. For it has been shown that God wills His being and goodness as principal object, which is the reason of His willing other things. Wherefore, in everything willed by Him, He wills His being and goodness, just as the sight sees light in every color. Now, it is impossible for God not to will a thing actually, for He would be only potentially willing, which is impossible, since His willing is His being. Therefore, it is necessary for Him to will His being and His goodness. Again, whoever wills, of necessity wills his last end. Thus man of necessity wills his own happiness, nor can he will unhappiness. Now God wills Himself as last end, as stated above. Therefore, He necessarily wills Himself to be, nor can He will Himself not to be. Moreover, the end in matters of appetite and action is as an undemonstrable principle in speculative matters. For just as in speculative matters conclusions are drawn from principles, so in active and appetitive matters the reason of all things to be done or desired is taken from the end. Now in speculative matters, the intellect necessarily assents to the first undemonstrable principles, to the contraries of which it can no wise assent. Therefore the will necessarily adheres to the last end, so as to be unable to will the contrary. And thus, if the will of God has no other end than Himself, He necessarily wills Himself to be. Again, all things, inasmuch as they are like to God, who is being first and foremost. Now all things, inasmuch as they are, love their own being naturally in their own way. Much more therefore does God love His own being naturally. Now His nature is per se necessary being, as was proved. Therefore God necessarily wills Himself to be. Further, every perfection and goodness which is in creatures belongs to God essentially, as we have proved above. But to love God is the highest perfection of the rational creature, since by so doing man is, in a way, united to God. Therefore, this is in God essentially. Therefore, He loves Himself necessarily, and so He wills Himself to be. End of chapter 80. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 81 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 81. That God does not necessarily will other things than Himself. Now if God wills the divine goodness and being necessarily, someone might think that He wills other things necessarily also, since He wills all else by willing His own goodness, as we have already proved. Yet to those who look at it aright, it is clear that He wills other things not of necessity. For He wills other things as ordered to the end which is His goodness. Now the will is not necessarily directed to the means, if the end is possible without them. For the physician, supposing him to have the will to heal, has no need to prescribe to the patient those remedies without which he can heal the patient. Since, then, God's goodness can be without other things, nay more, since nothing accrues thereto from other things, he is under no necessity to will other things through willing his own goodness. Again, since the good understood is the proper object of the will, any concept of the intellect, provided it retains an aspect of goodness, can be an object of the will. Wherefore, although the being of a thing as such is good, and its not being an evil, the not being of a thing can be an object of the will by reason of some connected good which is retained, albeit not of necessity. Because it is a good for a thing to be, even though another be non-existent. Hence that good alone is the will, according to its nature, unable to will not to be, without the existence of which the aspect of good is wholly done away. Now such a good is God alone. Wherefore the will, according to its nature, is able to will the not being of anything whatever, except God. Now will is in God according to its full capacity, since all things in him are in every way perfect. Hence God can will the not being of anything whatever, except himself. Therefore, he does not necessarily will things other than himself. Moreover, God, by willing his own goodness, wills other things to be, inasmuch as they partake of his goodness. Now, since God's goodness is infinite, it can be participated in an infinite number of ways, and in other ways besides those in which it is participated by those creatures which now are. If, then, through willing his own goodness, he willed of necessity the things which participate it would follow that he wills an infinite number of creatures partaking of his goodness in an infinite number of ways. But this is clearly false. For if he willed it, they would exist, since his will is the source of being to things, as we shall prove further on. Therefore, he does not necessarily will those things also that are not. Again, a wise man, through willing the cause, wills the effect which follows necessarily from the cause. For it would be foolish to will that the sun exist above the earth, and that there be no brightness of day. On the contrary, it is not necessary for one, through willing the cause, to will an effect which does not follow of necessity from the cause. Now other things proceed from God not necessarily, as we shall show further on. Therefore, it is not necessary that God will other things through willing himself. Moreover, things proceed from God as products of art from a craftsman, as we shall show further on. Now the craftsman, though he will himself to have his art, does not necessarily will to produce his work. Therefore, neither does God necessarily will things other than himself. We must accordingly consider why it is that God knows of necessity other things than himself, whereas he wills them not of necessity. And yet through understanding and willing himself, he understands and wills other things. The reason is this: because that the person who understands something is due to the understanding person being conditioned in a certain way, insofar as a thing is actually understood through its likeness being in the person who understands it. Whereas that the willer wills something is due to the thing willed being conditioned in some way, since we will a thing either because it is an end, or because it is directed to an end. Now the divine perfection necessarily requires that all things should be in God, in order that they may be understood in Him, whereas the divine goodness does not necessarily demand that the other things which are directed to it as their end should exist. For this reason, it is necessary that God should know, but not will, other things. Wherefore, neither does He will all things that can possibly be directed to His goodness, although He knows all that can in any way be directed to His essence, whereby He understands. End of chapter 81. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 82 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 82. Objections against the statement that God wills not of necessity things other than Himself, in that it involves impossibilities. Nevertheless, it would seem to lead to impossibilities if God does not necessarily will the things that He wills. For if God's will is not determined in respect of certain things that He wills, it would seem that He is indifferent. Now every power that is indifferent is somewhat in potentiality, since the indifferent is a species of possible contingency. Therefore, God's will would be in potentiality, and consequently, it would not be God's substance, wherein there is no potentiality, as we have shown above. Again, if a potential being as such is naturally changeable, since what is possible to be is possible to not be, it follows also that the divine will is changeable. Further, if it is natural for God to will something concerning His effects, it is necessary. Now nothing can be in Him that is not natural to Him, for nothing accidental or violent can be in Him, as we have proved above. Again, if that which is indifferent to either of two alternatives does not tend to the one rather than to the other, unless it be determined by something else, it follows that either God wills none of the things to which He is indifferent, the contrary of which has been proved above, or else He is determined to one alternative by something else. And thus something will be before Him that determines Him to one thing. Now none of these consequences follow of necessity. For indifference may befit a power in two ways. First, on the part of the power itself. Secondly, in respect of that to which it is said to be indifferent. On the part of the power itself, when it has not yet reached its perfection, whereby it is determined to one thing. Wherefore this argues imperfection in the power, and potentiality is proved to be in it, as may be seen in the intellect of one who doubts, for it has not yet acquired the principles by which it may be determined to one alternative. On the part of the thing to which it is said to be indifferent, a power is found to be indifferent to either alternative, when the perfect operation of the power depends on neither, and yet either is possible, even as an art which can use various instruments that are equally adapted to perfect its work. Now this does not argue imperfection in the power, rather does it pertain to its perfection, inasmuch as it transcends both alternatives, and for this reason is determined to neither, being indifferent to both. It is thus with God's will in regard to other things than himself, since its end depends on none of these other things, whereas it is most perfectly united to its end. Therefore it does not follow that there must be potentiality in the divine will. Likewise, neither does it follow that there is changeableness. For if there is no potentiality in God's will, the reason why, in his effects, he does not of necessity give preference to the one alternative is not because he is considered to be indifferent to either alternative, so as to be at first potentially willing either, and afterwards willing actually, whereas he is always actually willing whatsoever he wills with regard not only to himself but also his effects. But it is because the thing willed is not necessarily related to the divine goodness, which is the proper object of the divine will. In the same way in which we say that an enunciation is not necessary but possible, where the predicate is not necessarily related to the subject. Hence when we say, God wills this effect, this statement is clearly not necessary but possible, in the same way as a thing is said to be possible, not in reference to a potentiality, but because it is neither necessary nor impossible for it to be, as the philosopher teaches in the 6th book of Metaphysics. Thus the statement that a triangle has two equal sides is possible, yet not in reference to a potentiality, since in mathematics there is neither potentiality nor movement. Therefore, the exclusion of the aforesaid necessity does not remove the unchangeableness of the divine will, to which Holy Writ bears witness in the 1st book of Kings, chapter 15, verse 29. The triumpher in Israel will not be moved to repentance. Yet although God's will is not determined to its effects, it does not follow that he wills none of them, or that he is determined by something outside to will them. For, since the apprehended good determines the will as the latter's proper object, while God's intellect is not outside his will, because each is his essence, if God's will is determined by the will of his intellect to will something, the determination of the divine will is not affected by something outside. For the divine intellect apprehends not only the divine being which is his goodness, but also other goods, as we proved above. And it apprehends these as likenesses of the divine goodness, not as principles thereof. Wherefore, the divine will tends to them as according with his goodness, not as necessary thereto. It is the same with our will, because when it tends to something as simply necessary to an end, it is moved by a kind of necessity towards it, whereas when it tends to something merely on account of some fittingness, it does not tend thereto of necessity. Therefore, neither does the divine will tend necessarily to its effects. Nor does it follow on account of what has been said, that we must admit the existence in God of something not natural. For his will, by the one and same act, wills himself and other things. Now his relation to himself is necessary and natural, whereas his relation to other things is by way of a kind of fittingness, not necessary and natural, nor violent and unnatural, but voluntary, since what is voluntary must needs be neither natural nor violent. End of chapter 82. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 83 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 83. That God wills something other than himself by a necessity of supposition. We may conclude from the foregoing that, although God wills none of his effects of absolute necessity, he wills something necessarily by supposition. For it has been proved that the divine will is unchangeable. Now that which is once in an unchangeable thing cannot afterwards not be therein, since we say that a thing is changed when its condition is different now to what it was before. Therefore, if God's will is unchangeable, supposing that he wills something, it is necessary by supposition that he will it. Again, everything eternal is necessary. Now that God will some particular effect to exist is eternal, for his willing, like his being, is measured by eternity. Therefore it is necessary. Not, however, if we consider it absolutely, because God's will has not a necessary relation to this particular thing willed, therefore it is necessary by supposition. Further, whatsoever God could do, he can do, for his power is not diminished, as neither is his essence. But he cannot now not will what he is supposed to have willed, since his will is unchangeable. Therefore, he never could not will whatever he has willed. Therefore, it is necessary by supposition that he willed, as also that he will, whatever he willed. Neither, however, is necessary absolutely, but possible in the aforesaid manner. Moreover, whosoever wills a thing necessarily wills those things which are necessarily requisite to that thing, unless there be a defect on his part, either through ignorance, or because he is led astray from the right choice of means to the end in view, or by some passion. But these things cannot be said of God. Wherefore if God, in willing himself, wills something other than himself, it is necessary for him to will all that is necessarily required for what is willed by him. Even so is it necessary for God to will that there be a rational soul, supposing that he wills a man to be. End of chapter 83. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 84 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 84. That God's will is not of things impossible in themselves. Hence it is clear that God's will cannot be of things that are impossible in themselves. For the like are those which imply a contradiction in themselves. For instance, that a man be an ass, which implies that rational is irrational. Now that which is incompatible with a thing excludes some of those things which are required for that thing. For instance, to be an ass excludes man's reason. If then he wills necessarily the things that are required for those he is supposed to will, it is impossible that he will those that are incompatible with them. Hence it is impossible for him to will things that are simply impossible. Again, as was proved above, God, by willing his own being, which is his own goodness, wills all things as bearing a likeness to him. Now, insofar as a thing is incompatible with the notion of being as such, it cannot retain a likeness to the first, that is, the divine being, which is the source of being. Wherefore God cannot will that which is incompatible with the notion of being as such. Now, just as irrationality is incompatible with the notion of man as such, so it is incompatible with the notion of being as such, that anything be at the same time a being and a non-being. Hence God cannot will affirmation and negation to be true at the same time. Yet this is implied in everything which is in itself impossible, that it is incompatible with itself, inasmuch as it implies a contradiction. Therefore God's will cannot be of things impossible in themselves. Moreover, the will is only of some understood good, wherefore that which is not an object of the intellect cannot be an object of the will. Now things in themselves impossible are not an object of understanding, since they imply a contradiction, except perhaps through an error of one who understands not the property of things. And this cannot be said of God. Therefore things in themselves impossible cannot be an object of God's will. Further, according as a thing is related to being, so is it related to goodness. But impossibles are things that cannot be. Therefore, they cannot be good. Neither therefore can they be willed by God, who wills only the things that are or can be good. End of chapter 84. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 85 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 85. That the divine will does not remove contingency from things, nor impose absolute necessity on them. From what has been said, we may gather that the divine will does not exclude contingency, nor impose absolute necessity on things. For God wills all that is requisite for the thing which he wills, as already stated. Now it is befitting some things, according to the mode of their nature, that they be contingent and not necessary. Therefore he wills certain things to be contingent. Now the efficacy of the divine will requires not only that what God wills to be should be, but also that it should be in the mode that God wills it to be. For even in natural agents, when the active force is strong, it likens its effects to itself not only in its species, but also in its accidents, which are a kind of mode of that thing. Therefore the efficacy of the divine will does not remove contingency. Moreover, God wills the good of the universe the more especially than any particular good, according as the likeness of his goodness is more completely found therein. Now the completeness of the universe demands that some things should be contingent, else not all the degrees of being would be contained in the universe. Therefore God wills some things to be contingent. Again, the good of the universe consists in a certain order, as stated in the 11th book of Metaphysics. Now the order of the universe requires that certain causes be changeable, since bodies belong to the perfection of the universe, and they move not unless they be moved. Now from a changeable cause, contingent effects follow, since the effect cannot have more stable being than the cause. Hence we find that, though the remote cause be necessary, yet if the proximate cause be contingent, the effect is contingent. This is evidenced by what happens with the lower bodies, for they are contingent on account of the contingency of their proximate causes, although their remote causes, which are the heavenly movements, are necessary. Therefore, God wills some things to happen contingently. Further, necessity by supposition in a cause cannot argue absolute necessity in its effect. Now God wills something in the creature, not of absolute necessity, but only of necessity by supposition, as we have proved. Wherefore from the divine will we cannot argue absolute necessity in creatures. Now this alone excludes contingency, since even contingents that are indifferent to either of two alternatives become necessary by supposition. Thus it is necessary that Socrates be moved if he runs. Therefore the divine will does not exclude contingency from the things willed. Hence it does not follow, if God wills a thing, that it happens of necessity, but that this conditional proposition is true and necessary: if God wills a thing, it will be. And yet the consequence is not unnecessary. End of chapter 85. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 86 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 86. That a reason of the divine will can be assigned. We can gather from what has been said that it is possible to assign a reason of the divine will. For the end is the reason of willing the means. Now God wills His goodness as an end, and He wills all else as means to that end. Therefore His goodness is the reason why He wills other things which are different from Him. Again, the particular good is directed to the good of the whole as its end, as the imperfect to the perfect. Now things are the object of the divine will according to their place in the order of good. Hence it follows that the good of the universe is the reason why God wills each particular good in the universe. Again, as we have shown above, supposing God to will a certain thing, it follows of necessity that He wills whatever is required for that thing. Now that which imposes necessity on something else is the reason why this other thing is. Therefore the reason why God wills that which is requisite for a thing is that the thing for which it is requisite may be. Accordingly, we may proceed thus in assigning the reason of the divine will. God wills man to have reason, that man may be. He wills man to be, that the universe may be complete. And He wills the good of the universe, because it is befitting His goodness. Yet these three reasons do not indicate the same relationship. For the divine goodness neither depends on the perfection of the universe, nor gains anything from it. Although the perfection of the universe depends necessarily on certain particular goods, which are not the essential parts of the universe, it depends on others not of necessity, although a certain goodness or beauty accrues to the universe through them, for instance, through such things as are merely for the protection or beauty of the other parts. And the particular good depends necessarily on those things which are absolutely required for it, although this also has certain things which are for its better being. Wherefore sometimes the reason of the divine will indicates only fittingness, sometimes utility, and sometimes necessity by supposition, but absolutely necessity only when God wills Himself. End of chapter 86. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 87 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 87. That nothing can be the cause of the divine will. Now, although it is possible to assign some reason of the divine will, it does not follow that anything is the cause of that will. For the end is to the will the cause of willing. Now the end of God's will is His goodness. Therefore this is the cause of God's willing, and is the selfsame as the act of His will. But none of the other things willed by God is the cause of His willing, although one of them is the cause of another being directed to the divine goodness. And it is in this sense that God wills one of them on account of another. Nevertheless, it is clear that there is no need to allow of any discursion in the divine will, because where there is one act, we cannot find discursion, as we have proved above with regard to the intellect. Now God, by one act, wills his goodness and all else, since his action is his essence. By what we have said, we refute the error of some who say that all things proceed from God according to his simple will, so that no reason is to be given for anything except that God wills it. Moreover, this is contrary to divine Scripture, which declares that God made all things in accordance with the order of his wisdom, as expressed in the Psalm, "Thou hast made all things in wisdom." Again, it is written, in Ecclesiasticus 1:10, that God poured out his wisdom upon all his works. End of chapter 87. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 88 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book, On God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 88. That in God there is free will. It is possible to conclude from the foregoing that free will is to be found in God. For free will is applied to those things that one wills not of necessity, but of one's own accord. Wherefore in us there is free will in regard to our wishing to run or walk. Now God wills not of necessity things other than himself, as we have shown above. Therefore it is fitting that God should have free will. Again, the divine will, in those things to which it is not determined by its nature, is inclined in a way by the intellect, as we have shown above. Now man, to the exclusion of other animals, is said to have free will, because he is inclined to will by the judgment of his reason, and not by natural impulse, as brute animals are. Therefore, there is free will in God. Again, according to the philosopher in the third book of Ethics, will is of the end, but choice is of the means to the end. Wherefore, since God wills himself as end, and other things as means to the end, it follows that in regard to himself he has will only, but in respect of other things, choice. Now choice is always an act of free will. Therefore, free will is befitting God. Further, through having free will, man is said to be master of his own actions. Now this is most befitting the first agent, whose action depends on no other. Therefore, God has free will. This may also be gathered from the very signification of the word, for "the free is that which is its own cause," according to the philosopher at the beginning of the Metaphysics. And to none is this more befitting than to the first cause, which is God. End of chapter 88. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 89 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book, On God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 89. That the passions of the appetite are not in God. From the foregoing, we may conclude that the passions of the appetite are not in God. For there is no passion in the intellective appetite, but only in the sensitive, as is proved in the seventh book of Physics. Now no such appetite can be in God, since he has no knowledge through senses, as clearly results from what has been said. Therefore it follows that no passion of the appetite is in God. Further, every passion of the appetite is accompanied by a bodily change, for instance, in respect of the contraction and dilatation of the heart or something of the kind. But none of these can possibly happen in God, since he is not a body, nor a power in a body, as we have shown above. Therefore, there is no passion of the appetite in him. Again, in every passion of the appetite, the patient is somewhat drawn outside its ordinary, even or connatural disposition, a sign of which is that these passions, if they become intense, cause an animal's death. But it is impossible for God to be in any way drawn outside his natural disposition, since he is utterly unchangeable, as was shown above. It is therefore evident that these passions cannot be in God. Moreover, every emotion that is accompanied by a passion has one definite object, according to the mode and measure of the passion. For a passion has an impulse to some one thing, even as nature has, and on this account it needs to be curbed and ruled by reason. Now the divine will is not in itself determined to one in things created, except by the ordering of his wisdom, as was proved above. Therefore there is no emotional passion in him. Again, every passion is in a subject that is in potentiality. But God is altogether free of potentiality, since he is pure act. Therefore he is agent only, and in no way can passion take place in him. Accordingly, all passion by reason of its genus is absent from God. Some passions, however, are absent from God not only by reason of their genus, but also on account of their species. For every passion takes its species from its object. Wherefore a passion whose object is wholly unbefitting God is absent from God on account of its proper species. Such a passion is sorrow or pain, for its object is an actually inherent evil, just as the object of joy is a good present and possessed. Sorrow, therefore, and pain, by their very nature, cannot be in God. Again, the formality of a passion's object is taken not only from good or evil, but also from the fact that a person is referred in some mode to the one or the other. For thus it is that hope and joy differ. Wherefore, if the mode in which a person is referred to the object, that mode being essential to the passion, is not becoming to God, neither can the passion itself be becoming to God, and this by reason of its proper species. Now, although hope has a good for its object, this is a good not already acquired, but to be yet obtained, and this cannot be competent to God on account of his perfection, which is so great that nothing can be added to it. Hope, therefore, cannot be in God, even by reason of its species, nor again desire of anything not possessed. Moreover, just as the divine perfection excludes from God the potentiality of acquiring any additional good, so too, and much more, it excludes the potentiality to evil. Now fear regards evil that may be imminent, even as hope regards a good to be acquired. Wherefore fear, by reason of its species, is absent from God on two counts, both because it is befitting only one that is in potentiality, and because its object is an evil that can become present. Again, repentance denotes a change in the appetite, wherefore the idea of repentance is inapplicable to God, both because it is a kind of sorrow, and because it implies a change of will. Further, without error in the cognitive power, it is impossible for that which is good to be apprehended as evil, nor does it happen that the evil of one can be the good of another, save in particular goods, wherein the corruption of one is the generation of another, while the universal good is nowise impaired by any particular good, but is reflected by each one. Now God is the universal good, and by partaking of his likeness, all things are said to be good. Hence no one's evil can be to him a good, nor is it possible for him to apprehend as evil that which is good simply, and is not evil to him, because his knowledge is without error, as we have proved above. Hence envy cannot possibly be in God, even according to the nature of its species, not only because envy is a kind of sorrow, but because it grieves for the good of another, and thus looks upon another's good as its own evil. Again, to grieve for a good is like desiring an evil, for the former results from a good being deemed an evil, while the latter results from an evil being deemed a good. Now anger is the desire of another's evil in revenge. Therefore anger is far removed from God according to its specific nature, not only because it is an effect of sorrow, but also because it is a desire for revenge on account of sorrow arising from a harm inflicted. Also, whatsoever passions are species or effects of the above are equally removed from God. End of chapter 89. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 90 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 90. That in God are delight and joy, nor are they incompatible with the divine perfection. There are, however, certain passions which, though unbecoming to God as passions, nevertheless contain nothing in their specific nature incompatible with the divine perfection. Among these are joy and delight. For joy has for its object a present good, wherefore neither by reason of its object, which is a good, nor by reason of the way in which it is referred to that object, which is actually possessed, is joy, according to its specific nature, incompatible with the divine perfection. Hence it is evident that joy or delight, properly speaking, is in God. Because just as good and evil apprehended are the object of the sensible appetite, so are they the object of the intellective appetite. For it belongs to both to ensue good and to avoid evil, whether so in truth or in the estimation, except that the object of the intellective appetite is more universal than that of the sensitive appetite, since the intellective appetite regards good or evil simply, whereas the sensitive appetite regards good or evil according to the senses, even as the object of the intellect is more universal than that of the senses. Now the operations of the appetite take their species from their objects. Accordingly, we find in the intellective appetite, which is the will, operations specifically similar to those of the sensitive appetite, differing in this, that in the sensitive appetite they are passions, on account of its connection with a bodily organ, whereas in the intellective appetite they are pure operations. For just as by the passion of fear which, in the sensitive appetite, one shuns a future evil, so, without passion, the intellective appetite has a like operation. Since, then, joy and delight are not inapplicable to God according to their species, but only as passions, while they are in the will according to their species, but not as passions, it follows that they are not absent from the divine will. Again, joy and delight are a kind of repose of the will in the object of its willing. Now God is supremely at rest in himself, who is the principal object of his will, as finding all sufficiency in himself. Therefore, by his will, he rejoices and delights supremely in himself. Further, delight is a perfection of operation, as the philosopher teaches in the 10th book of Ethics. For it perfects operation as beauty perfects youth. Now God has a most perfect operation in understanding, as shown above. Therefore, if our act of understanding is delightful on account of its perfection, God's act of understanding will be most delightful to him. Moreover, everything naturally rejoices in its like, as being congenial to it, except accidentally insofar as this thing is detrimental to it. Thus, potters quarrel amongst themselves, according to Aristotle in the Rhetoric, because one hinders the profit of another. Now every good is a likeness of the divine goodness, as stated above, nor is any good prejudicial to it. Therefore God rejoices in every good. Therefore joy and delight are in him, properly speaking. Yet joy and delight differ in aspect, for delight is caused by a good conjoined in reality, while joy does not require this conjunction, because the mere repose of the will in the thing willed suffices for the notion of joy. Hence delight is only in a conjoined good if it be taken in its proper sense, whereas joy is in a separate good. Wherefore it is evident that, properly speaking, God delights in himself, but rejoices in himself in other things. End of chapter 90. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 91 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 91. That in God there is love. In like manner it follows that love is in God as an act of his will. For it belongs properly to the nature of love that the lover wills the good of the beloved. Now God wills his own and others' good, as stated above. Accordingly, then, God loves both himself and other things. Again, true love requires one to will another's good as one's own. For a thing whose good one wills merely as conducive to another's good is loved accidentally. Thus he who wills wine to be preserved that he may drink it, or who loves a man that he may be useful or pleasing to him, loves the wine or the man accidentally, but himself properly speaking. Now God loves each thing's good as its own, since he wills each thing to be, inasmuch as it is good in itself, although he directs one to the profit of another. God, therefore, truly loves both himself and other things. Moreover, since everything naturally wills or desires its own good in its own way, if the nature of love is that the lover will or desire the good of the beloved, it follows that the lover is referred to the beloved as to a thing that is in a way one with him. Wherefore it appears that the proper notion of love consists in the affection of one tending to another as one with himself in some way. For which reason Dionysius describes love as a unitive force. Hence the greater the thing that makes the lover one with the beloved, the more intense is the love, for we love those more who are united to us by the origin of birth, or by frequent companionship, than those who are merely united to us by the bond of human nature. Again, the more the cause of union is deeply seated in the lover, the stronger the love, Wherefore sometimes a love that is caused by a passion becomes more intense than a love arising from natural origin or from some habit, although it is more liable to be transitory. Now the cause of all things being united to God, namely His goodness, which all things reflect, is exceedingly great and deeply seated in God, since Himself is His own goodness. Wherefore in God not only is there true love, but also most perfect and most abiding love. Again, on the part of its object, love does not denote anything inconsistent with God, since that object is a good. Nor again as regards the way in which it is referred to its object, since a thing when possessed is loved not less, but more, because a good is more closely united to us when possessed. Wherefore in natural things, movement towards an end is more intense if the end be near, although the contrary happens accidentally sometimes, for instance, when we discover something repugnant to love in the beloved, for then possession diminishes love. Accordingly, love is not inconsistent with the divine perfection as regards its specific nature. Therefore, it is in God. Further, it belongs to love to seek union, as Dionysius says. For since, on account of likeness or becomingness between lover and beloved, the affection of the lover is somehow united to the beloved, the appetite tends to the completion of the union, namely that the union which was begun in the affections be completed in actions. Wherefore, it belongs to friends to rejoice in mutual companionship, living together, and common pursuits. Now God moves all other things to union, for inasmuch as He gives them being and other perfections, He unites them to Himself as far as possible. Therefore God loves both Himself and other things. Again, love is the source of all the emotions. For joy and desire are only of a good that is loved. Fear and sorrow are only of evil that is contrary to the beloved good. And from these all the other emotions arise. Now joy and delight are in God, as we have shown above. Therefore, in God there is love. Someone, however, might think that God loves not one thing more than another. For if intenseness and remissness are proper to a changeable nature, they cannot apply to God, from whom all change is far removed. Again, none of the other things that are said of God by way of operation are applied to Him more or less, since He knows not one thing more than another, nor rejoices more in this than in that. Accordingly, it must be observed that while other operations of the soul are about one object only, love alone appears to be directed to a twofold object. For if we understand or rejoice, it follows that we are referred somehow to some object, whereas love wills something to someone, since we are said to love that to which we will some good, in the way aforesaid. Hence, when we want a thing, we are said simply and properly to desire it, and not to love it, but rather to love ourselves for whom we want it, and in consequence we are said to love it accidentally and improperly. Accordingly, other operations are intense or remiss in proportion to the energy alone of the action. But this cannot apply to God, because energy of action is measured by the force from which it proceeds, and every divine action is of one and the same force. On the other hand, love may be intense or remiss in two ways. In one way, as regards the good that we will someone, according to which we are said to love that person more for whom we will a greater good. In another way, as regards the energy of the action according to which we are said to love that person more, for whom, although we will not a greater good, nevertheless we will an equal good with greater fervor and efficacy. In the first way, accordingly, nothing forbids us to say that God loves one thing more than another, according as he wills for it a greater good. But in the second way this cannot be said, for the same reason as we have stated in the case of other operations. It is therefore clear from what has been said that none of our emotions, properly speaking, can be in God, except joy and love. And yet even these are not in him as they are in us, by way of passion. That joy or delight is in God is confirmed by the authority of Scripture. For it is said in the Psalm, "At thy right hand are delights even to the end." Divine wisdom, which is God, as we have proved, says in Proverbs 9, "I was delighted every day, playing before him." And in Luke 15:10, "There is joy in heaven upon one sinner doing penance." Also the philosopher says in the 7th book of Ethics, that God rejoices with one simple delight. Scripture also makes mention of God's love in Deuteronomy 33:3, "He hath loved the people," and in Jeremiah 31:3, "I have loved thee with an everlasting love," and in John 16:27, "For the Father himself loveth you." Certain philosophers also taught that God's love is the principle of things, in agreement with which is the saying of Dionysius in the Divine Names for that God's love did not allow him to be unproductive. It must, however, be observed that even other emotions which by their specific nature are inapplicable to God, are applied to God in Holy Writ, not indeed properly, as we have shown, but metaphorically, on account of a likeness either of effects or of some preceding emotion. I say "of effects," because sometimes his will, by the ordering of his wisdom, tends to an effect to which a person is inclined through a defective passion. Thus a judge punishes out of justice, as an angry man out of anger. Accordingly, sometimes God is said to be angry, inasmuch as by the ordering of his wisdom he wills to punish someone, according to the saying of the Psalm, "When his wrath shall be kindled in a short time." He is said to be merciful, inasmuch as out of his good will he removes man's unhappiness, even as we do the same through the passion of mercy. Hence the Psalm says, "The Lord is compassionate and merciful, long-suffering and plenteous in mercy." Sometimes also he is said to repent, inasmuch as, in accordance with the eternal and unchangeable decree of his providence, he makes what he destroyed before or destroys what he previously made, even as those who are moved by repentance are wont to do. Hence in Genesis 6:7, "It repenteth me that I have made man." That this cannot be taken in the proper sense is clear from the words of the first book of Kings 15:29, "The triumpher in Israel will not spare and will not be moved to repentance." I also say, on account of a likeness to a preceding emotion, for love and joy, which are in God properly, are the principles of all the emotions. Love, by way of moving principle; joy, by way of end. Wherefore, even an angry man rejoices while punishing, as having obtained his end. Hence God is said to grieve, inasmuch as certain things occur contrary to those he loves and approves, even as we grieve for what has happened against our will. This is instanced in Isaiah 49, verses 15 and 16. "God saw, and it appeared evil in his eyes, because there is no judgment. And he saw that there is not a man, and he stood astonished, because there is none to oppose himself." By what has been said, we can refute the error of certain Jews who ascribed to God anger, sorrow, repentance, and all such passions in their proper sense, failing to discriminate between the proper and the metaphorical expressions of Scripture. End of chapter 91. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 92 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 92. How virtues are to be ascribed to God. In sequence to what has been said, we must show how virtues are to be ascribed to God. For just as his being is universally perfect, in some way containing within himself the perfection of all beings, so must his goodness in some way comprise the various kinds of goodness of all things. Now virtue is a kind of goodness of the virtuous person, since, in respect thereof he is said to be good and his work good. It follows, therefore, that the divine goodness contains in its own way all virtues. Wherefore none of them is ascribed as a habit to God as it is to us. For it is not befitting God to be good through something else added to him, but by his essence, for he is altogether simple. Nor does he act by anything added to his essence, since his action is his being, as we have shown. Therefore, his virtue is not a habit, but his essence. Again, habit is imperfect act, a mean, as it were, between potentiality and act. Wherefore one who has a habit is compared to a person asleep. But in God there is most perfect act. Hence act in him is not like a habit, as knowledge, but like to consider, which is an ultimate and perfect act. Again, habit perfects a potentiality, but in God nothing is potential but only actual. Therefore, a habit cannot be in him. Further, habit is a kind of accident, and this is utterly foreign to God, as we have proved above. Neither, therefore, is virtue ascribed to God as a habit, but only as his essence. Now, since it is by human virtues that human life is regulated, and since human life is twofold, contemplative and active, those virtues which belong to the active life as perfecting it cannot be becoming to God. For the active life of man consists in the use of bodily goods, wherefore those virtues regulate the active life by which we use these goods aright. But these goods cannot be befitting God. Therefore, neither can these virtues, insofar as they regulate this life. Again, the like virtues perfect man's conduct in his civil life, wherefore they do not seem very applicable to those who have nothing to do with the civil life. Much less, therefore, can they be applied to God, whose conduct and life are far removed from the manner of human life. Moreover, some of the virtues that are connected with the active life regulate us in regard to the passions. These we cannot ascribe to God. For those virtues which are concerned with the passions take their species from those very passions as from their proper objects. Wherefore, temperance differs from fortitude, because the former is about desires, while the latter is about fear and daring. But in God there are no passions, as we have proved. Neither, therefore, can these virtues be in God. Again, these same virtues are not in the intellective part of the soul, but in the sensitive part, wherein alone can the passions be, as is proved in the 7th book of Physics. But there is no sensitive faculty in God, but only intellect. It follows, therefore, that these virtues cannot be in God, even according to their proper signification. Some of the passions about which these virtues are concerned result from an inclination of the appetite to some bodily good that is pleasant to the senses, for instance, meat, drink, and sexual matters, and in respect of the desires for these things, there are sobriety, chastity, and, speaking in a general way, temperance and continency. Wherefore, since bodily pleasures are utterly removed from God, the aforesaid virtues neither apply to God properly, since they are about passions, nor even are they applied to God metaphorically in the Scriptures, because no likeness to them is to be found in God, as regards a likeness in their effects. And there are some passions resulting from an inclination of the appetite to a spiritual good, such as honor, dominion, victory, revenge, and so forth. And about our hopes, darings, and any acts whatsoever of the appetite in respect of these things, there are fortitude, magnanimity, meekness, and other like virtues. These cannot be in God properly, because they are about the passions, but they are applied metaphorically to God in Scripture on account of a likeness of effect. For instance, in the first book of Kings 2:2, "There is none strong like our God," and in Micah 6, "Seek the meek, seek the good." End of chapter 92. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 93 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 93. That in God there are the moral virtues which are about actions. Now there are some virtues which regulate man's active life, and are concerned not with passions, but with actions, such as truth, justice, liberality, magnificence, prudence, and art. Now since virtue derives its species from its object or matter, while the actions that are the matter or object of these virtues are not inconsistent with the divine perfection, neither is there in these virtues, according to their proper species, anything for which they should be excluded from the divine perfection. Again, these virtues are perfections of the will and intellect, which are principles of operation without passion. Now in God there are will and intellect, wherein there is no lack of perfection. Therefore, these virtues cannot be lacking in God. Moreover, the proper reason about all things that take their being from God exists in the divine intellect, as we have proved above. Now the reason in the craftsman's mind about the thing to be made is art. Wherefore the philosopher says in the 6th book of Ethics that art is right reason about things to be made. Therefore, art is properly in God, and for this reason it is said in Wisdom 7:21, "Wisdom, the artificer of all things, taught me." Again, God's will in things other than himself is determined to one particular thing by his knowledge, as was shown above. Now knowledge, directing the will to operation, is prudence, since prudence, according to the philosopher in the 6th book of Ethics, is right reason about things to be done. Therefore, prudence is in God, and this is what is said in Job 26, "With him is prudence and strength." Again, it was shown above that through willing a particular thing, God wills whatever is required for that thing. Now that which is requisite for a perfection of a thing is due to it. Therefore in God there is justice, which consists in rendering to each one what is his. Wherefore it is said in the psalm, "The Lord is just, and hath loved justice." Moreover, as shown above, the last end, for the sake of which God wills all things, nowise depends on the things directed to the end, neither as to its being, nor as to any perfection. Wherefore he wills to communicate his goodness to a thing, not that he may gain thereby, but because the very act of communicating is befitting him as the source of goodness. Now to give, not for a gain expected from the giving, but through goodness and becomingness, is an act of liberality, as the philosopher teaches in the 4th book of Ethics. Therefore God is most liberal, and as Avicenna says, he alone can properly be called liberal, since every other agent, except God, gains by his action some good which is the end in view. Scripture declares this his liberality when it says in the psalm, "When thou openest thy hand, they shall all be filled with good." And in James 1:5, "Who giveth to all men abundantly, and upbraideth not." Again, all that receive being from God must needs bear his likeness, inasmuch as they are, and are good, and have their proper types in the divine intellect, as we have shown above. Now it belongs to the virtue of truth, according to the philosopher, in the 4th book of Ethics, that "a man by his words and deeds show himself such as he is." Therefore in God is the virtue of truth. Hence it is said in Romans 3:4, "Now God is true," and in the psalm, "All thy ways are truth." But whatever virtues are directed to certain actions of subjects in reference to superiors are inapplicable to God, for instance, obedience, religion, and the like which are due to a superior. Again, the aforesaid virtues cannot be ascribed to God in respect of any of their acts that may be imperfect. Thus prudence, as to its act of taking good counsel, is not befitting God. For since counsel is an inquiry, according to the 6th book of Ethics, whereas the divine knowledge is not inquisitive, as was proved above, it cannot become it to take counsel. Wherefore we read in Job 26:3, "To whom hast thou given counsel? Perhaps to him that hath no wisdom?" And in Isaiah 40:14, "With whom hath he consulted? And who hath instructed him?" On the other hand, as regards the act of judging of things counselled, and the choice of those approved, nothing hinders prudence being ascribed to God. However, counsel is sometimes ascribed to God either by reason of a likeness in the point of secrecy, for counsels are taken in secret, wherefore the secrets of the divine wisdom are called counsels, metaphorically. For instance, in Isaiah 25:1, according to another version, "May thy counsel of old be verified." Or in the point of satisfying those who seek counsel of him, for it belongs to one who understands, even without discursion, to instruct inquirers. Likewise justice, as to its act of commutation, cannot be ascribed to God, since he receives not from anyone. Hence we read in Romans 11:35, "Who hath first given to him, and recompense shall be made him." And in Job 41:2, "Who hath given me before that I should repay him?" However, we are said metaphorically to give certain things to God, inasmuch as God accepts our gifts. Hence it is befitting him to have not commutative, but only distributive justice. Wherefore Dionysius says in On the Divine Names 8 that God is praised for his justice because he distributes to all according to their merits. As expressed by those words of Matthew 25:15, he gave to everyone according to his proper ability. It must be noted, however, that the actions about which the aforesaid virtues are concerned do not by their nature depend on human affairs, for to judge of what has to be done, and to give or distribute something, belongs not to man alone, but to every intelligent being. But so far as they are confined to human concerns, they, to a certain extent, take their species from them, just as a crooked nose makes a species of ape. Accordingly, the aforesaid virtues, so far as they regulate man's active life, are directed to those actions as confined to human affairs and taking their species from them. In this way they cannot be ascribed to God. But so far as the aforesaid actions are understood in a general sense, they can be adapted even to things divine. For just as man is a dispenser of human things, such as money or honors, so is God the bestower of all the goods of the universe. Hence the aforesaid virtues in God have a more universal range than in man. For just as justice in man relates to the state or the household, so God's justice extends to the whole universe. Wherefore, the divine virtues are called exemplar virtues, because things that are limited and particularized are likenesses of absolute beings, as the light of a candle in comparison with the light of the sun. But other virtues, which properly are not applicable to God, have no exemplar in the divine nature, but only in the divine wisdom, which contains the proper types of all beings, as is the case with other corporeal things. End of chapter 93. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 94 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 94. That the contemplative virtues are in God. There can be no doubt that the contemplative virtues are most becoming to God. For since wisdom consists in the knowledge of the highest causes, according to the philosopher at the beginning of his metaphysics, and since God knows himself principally, nor knows aught save by knowing himself, as we have proved, who is the first cause of all, it is evident that wisdom ought to be especially ascribed to him. Hence we read in Job 9:4, "He is wise in heart," and Ecclesiasticus 1:1, "All wisdom is from the Lord God, and hath been always with him." The philosopher too says at the beginning of his metaphysics that it is a divine, not a human possession. Again, since science is the knowledge of a thing by its proper cause, and since he knows the order of all causes and effects, as we have shown above, it is evident that science is properly in him. Not that science, however, which is caused by reasoning, as our science is caused by a demonstration. Hence it is written in the first book of Kings 2:3, "The Lord is a God of all knowledge." Further, since immaterial knowledge of things without discoursing is understanding, and since God has this kind of knowledge about all things, as proved above, it follows that in him is understanding. Hence we read in Job 12:13, "He hath counsel and understanding." In God, these virtues are the exemplars of ours, as the perfect of the imperfect. End of chapter 94. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 95 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 95. That God cannot will evil. From what has been said, it can be proved that God cannot will evil. For the virtue of a thing is that by which one produces a good work. Now every work of God is a work of virtue, since his virtue is his essence, as we have shown above. Therefore, he cannot will evil. Again, the will never tends towards evil unless there be an error in the reason, at least as regards the particular object of choice. For since the object of the will is an apprehended good, the will cannot tend towards an evil unless, in some way, it is proposed to it as a good, and this cannot be without an error. Now there can be no error in the divine knowledge, as we have shown. Therefore, God's will cannot tend to evil. Moreover, God is the sovereign good, as was proved above. Now the sovereign good does not suffer the company of evil, as neither does the supremely hot suffer an admixture of cold. Therefore, the divine will cannot be inclined to evil. Further, since good has the aspect of end, evil cannot be an object of the will except the latter turn away from its end. But the divine will cannot turn away from its end, because he cannot will anything except by willing himself, as we have proved. Therefore, he cannot will evil. It is therefore evident that in him free will is naturally established in good. This is expressed in the words of Deuteronomy 32:4, God is faithful and without any iniquity. And in Habakkuk 1:13, thy eyes are pure, and thou canst not look on iniquity. Hereby is confuted the error of the Jews who assert, in the Talmud, that God sins sometimes and is cleansed from sin, and also of the Luciferiani, who say that God sinned in casting out Lucifer. End of chapter 95. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 96 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 96. That God hates nothing, nor can the hatred of anything be ascribed to him. Hence it appears that hatred of a thing cannot be ascribed to God, because as love is related to good, so is hatred to evil. For we will good to those whom we love, but evil to those whom we hate. Therefore, if God's will cannot be inclined to evil, as was proved above, it is impossible for him to hate anything. Again, as we have shown above, God's will tends to things other than himself, inasmuch as, by willing and loving his being and goodness, he wills it to be poured forth, as far as possible, by communicating its likeness. Accordingly, that which God wills in things other than himself is that the likeness of his goodness be in them. Now the goodness of each thing consists in its partaking of the divine likeness, since every other goodness is nothing but a likeness of the first goodness. Therefore, God wills good to everything, and consequently, he hates nothing. Again, from the first being, all others take the origin of their being. Wherefore, if he hates any one of the things that are, he wills it not to be, because to be is a thing's good. Hence, he wills his action not to be, whereby that thing is brought into being mediately or immediately. For it has been proved above that if God wills a thing, it follows that he wills whatever is required for that thing. But this is impossible. And this is evident if things are brought into being by his will, since in that case the action whereby things are produced must be voluntary, and likewise if he be the cause of things naturally, because just as his nature pleases him, so also everything that his nature requires pleases him. Therefore, God hates not anything. Further, that which is found naturally in all active causes must most of all be found in the first active cause. Now, every active cause loves its effect as such in its own way. For instance, parents love their children, a poet his poems, a craftsman his handiwork. Much more, therefore, God hates nothing, since he is the cause of all. This agrees with the saying of Wisdom 11:25, "Thou lovest all the things that are, and hatest none of the things which thou hast made." And yet God is said metaphorically to hate certain things, and this in two ways. First, from the fact that God, in loving things, and willing their good to be, wills the contrary evil not to be. Wherefore he is said to hate evils, since we are said to hate that which we will not to be. According to Zechariah 8:17, "Let none of you imagine evil in your hearts against his friend, and love not a false oath, for all these things are the things that I hate, saith the Lord." But such things are not his effects, as subsistent things, to which hatred or love are directed, properly speaking. The other way is due to God willing some greater good that cannot be without the privation of a lesser good. And thus he is said to hate, since to do more than this were to love. For, in this way, forasmuch as he wills the good of justice, or of the order of the universe, which good is impossible without the punishment or destruction of some, he is said to hate those whose punishment or destruction he wills. According to Malachi 1:3, "I have hated Esau." And the words of the psalm, "Thou hatest all the workers of iniquity, thou wilt destroy all that speak a lie. The bloody and the deceitful man the Lord will abhor." End of chapter 96. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 97 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 97. That God is a living being. From what has already been proved, it follows of necessity that God is a living being. For it has been shown that in God there are intelligence and will. Now intelligence and will are only in that which lives. Therefore, God is a living being. Again, life is ascribed to certain things inasmuch as they seem to be set in motion of themselves and not by another. For which reason, things which seem to be moved of themselves, the cause of which movement is not perceived by the unlearned, are described metaphorically as living. For instance, we speak of the living water of a flowing source, but not of a tank or stagnant pond, and of quicksilver, which seems to have a kind of movement. For properly speaking, those things alone are themselves in motion, which move themselves, being composed of a mover and moved, such as animate beings. Wherefore such things alone are said to live, while all others are moved by some other thing, either as generating them, or as removing an obstacle, or as impelling them. And since sensible operations are accompanied by movement, furthermore, whatever moves itself to its proper operations, although these be without movement, is said to live. Wherefore intelligence, appetite, and sensation are vital actions. Now God especially works not as moved by another, but by himself, since he is the first active cause. Therefore to live is befitting him above all. Again, the divine being contains every perfection of being, as was shown above. Now life is a kind of perfect existence, wherefore living beings are placed above non-living beings in the order of beings. Therefore, God's being is life. Therefore, he is a living being. This is confirmed by the authority of divine scripture, for it is said in Deuteronomy 32, verse 40, in the person of the Lord, "I will say, I live forever." And in the Psalm, "My heart and my flesh have rejoiced in the living God." End of chapter 97. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 98 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 98. That God is his own life. From this, it further appears that God is his own life. For life, in a living being, is the same as to live, expressed in the abstract, just as a running is in reality the same as to run. Now, in living things to live is to be, as the philosopher declares in the second book on the soul. For since an animal is said to be living because it has a soul whereby it has existence, as it were by its proper form, it follows that to live is nothing but a particular kind of existence resulting from a particular kind of form. Now God is his own existence, as proved above. Therefore, he is his own living and his own life. Again, intelligence is a kind of life, as the philosopher declares, also in the second book on the soul, since to live is the act of a living being. Now God is his own act of intelligence, as we have proved. Therefore, he is his own living and his own life. Moreover, if God were not his own life, since he is a living being as shown above, it would follow that he is living by a participation of life. Now whatever is by participation is reduced to that which is by its essence. Wherefore God would be reduced to something preceding him whereby he would live. But this is impossible, as is evident from what has been said. Again, if God is a living being, as we have proved, it follows that life is in him. Wherefore, if he be not his own life, there will be something in him that is not himself, and consequently he will be composite. But this was disproved above. Therefore, God is his own life. This is what is said in John 14:6, "I am the life." End of chapter 98. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 99 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 99. That God's life is eternal. It follows from this that God's life is eternal. For nothing ceases to live except by being severed from life. But nothing can be severed from itself, for all severance results from the separation of one thing from another. Therefore, it is impossible that God cease to live, since himself is his own life, as we have proved. Again, whatever sometimes is and sometimes is not results from a cause, For nothing brings itself from not being to being, since what is not yet acts not. Now the divine life has no cause, as neither has the divine existence. Therefore, he is not sometimes living and sometimes not living, but is ever living. Therefore, his life is eternal. Again, in every operation, the operator remains, although sometimes the operation is transitory by way of succession. Wherefore, in movement, the thing moved remains the same identically, though not logically. Hence, where action is the agent itself, it follows that nothing passes by in succession, but that the whole is throughout the same simultaneously. Now in God, to understand and to live are God himself, as was proved. Therefore, his life is without succession, and is simultaneously whole. Therefore, it is eternal. Moreover, God is utterly unchangeable, as we have proved above. But that which begins or ceases to live, or is subject to succession in living, is changeable. For the life of a being begins by generation and ceases by corruption, and succession results from change of some kind. Therefore, God neither began to be, nor will cease to be, nor is subject to succession in living. Therefore, his life is eternal. Wherefore it is said in Deuteronomy 32 verse 40, in the person of the Lord, I live forever. And in the first letter of John chapter 5, this is the true God and life eternal. End of chapter 99. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 100 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 100. That God is happy. It remains for us to show, from the foregoing, that God is happy. For happiness is the proper good of every intellectual nature. Since, then, God is intelligent, his proper good is happiness. Now he is compared to his proper good, not as that which tends to a good not yet possessed, for this belongs to a nature that is changeable and in potentiality, but as that which already possesses its proper good. Wherefore, he not only desires happiness as we do, but enjoys it. Therefore, he is happy. Moreover, an intellectual nature desires and wills, above all, that which is most perfect in it, and this is its happiness. And the most perfect thing in every being is its most perfect operation. For power and habit are perfected by operation, wherefore the philosopher says that happiness is a perfect operation. Now the perfection of operation depends on four things. First, on its genus, namely, that it abide in the operator. And by an operation abiding in the operator, I mean one by which nothing else is done besides the operation, for instance, to see or to hear. For the like are perfections of those things whose operations they are, and can be something ultimate, because they are not directed to something made as their end. On the other hand, an operation or action from which there follows something done besides the action itself is a perfection of the thing done, not of the doer, and is compared to the doer as its end. Hence, such an operation of the intellectual nature is not beatitude or happiness. Secondly, on the principle of operation, that it should be an operation of the highest power. Hence happiness is in us not by an operation of the senses, but by an operation of the intellect perfected by a habit. Thirdly, on the object of the operation. For this reason, ultimate happiness in us consists in understanding the highest object of our intellect. Fourthly, on the form of operation, namely that the operation should be performed perfectly, easily, constantly, and pleasurably. Now such is the operation of God. For He is intelligent, and His intellect is the sovereign power, not needs to be perfected by a habit, since it is perfect in itself, as we proved above. He also understands Himself who is the highest of intelligible objects, perfectly, without any difficulty, and pleasurably. Therefore, He is happy. Again, every desire is set at rest by happiness, because once it is possessed, nothing remains to be desired, for it is the last end. Accordingly, He must be happy, since He is perfect in all things and can be desired. Wherefore, Boethius says that happiness is a state made perfect by the assemblage of all good things. Now such is the divine perfection that it contains every perfection with simplicity, as shown above. Therefore, He is truly happy. Again, as long as a person lacks that for which he needs, he is not yet happy, for his desire is not yet set at rest. Whosoever, therefore, is self-sufficient, needing nothing, is happy. Now it was proved above that God needs not other things, since His perfection depends on nothing outside Him. Nor does He will other things for His own sake as their end, as though He needed them, but merely because this is befitting His goodness. Therefore, He is happy. Further, it has been proved that God cannot will what is impossible. Now, it is impossible for anything to accrue to Him that He has not already, since He is nowise in potentiality, as we have shown. Therefore He cannot will to have what He has not. Whatever then He wills, He has. Nor does He will anything ill, as we have proved. Therefore He is happy, according as some assert that a happy man is one who has whatever he desires, and desires nothing amiss. Holy Writ also bears witness to His happiness in 1 Timothy 6, which in His times He shall show, who is blessed and mighty. End of chapter 100. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 101 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 101. That God is His own happiness. It follows from this that God is His own happiness. For His happiness is His intellectual operation, as we have shown, and it was proved above that God's act of intelligence is His substance. Therefore, He is His own happiness. Again, happiness, since it is the last end, is that which everyone wills principally, whether he has a natural inclination for it, or possesses it already. Now it has been proved that God principally wills His essence. Therefore, His essence is His happiness. Further, whatever a person wills, he directs to his happiness. For happiness is what is not desired on account of something else, and is the term of the movement of desire in one who desires one thing for the sake of another, else that movement will be indefinite. Since then God wills all other things for the sake of His goodness, which is His essence, it follows that He is His own happiness, even as He is His own essence and his own goodness. Moreover, there cannot be two sovereign goods, for if either lacked what the other has, neither would be sovereign and perfect. Now, it has been shown above that God is the sovereign good, and it will be proved that happiness is the supreme good, since it is the last end. Therefore, happiness and God are one and the same. Therefore, God is his own happiness. End of chapter 101. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 102 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 102. That God's happiness is perfect and singular, surpassing all other happiness. Furthermore, from what has been said, we are able to consider the excellence of the divine happiness. For the nearer a thing is to happiness, the more perfectly it is happy. Hence, although a person be called happy on account of his hope of obtaining happiness, his happiness can nowise be compared to the happiness of one who has already actually obtained it. Now that which is happiness itself is nearest of all to happiness, and this has been proved to be true of God. Therefore he is singularly and perfectly happy. Again, since joy is caused by love, as was proved, where there is greater love, there is greater joy in possessing the thing loved. Now, other things being equal, every being loves itself more than another, a sign of which is that the nearer a thing is to one, the more is it naturally loved. Therefore God rejoices more in his own happiness, which is himself, than the other blessed in their happiness, which is not themselves. Therefore his happiness sets his desire more at rest and is more perfect. Further, that which is by essence transcends that which is by participation. Thus the nature of fire is found to be more perfect in fire itself than in that which is ignited. Now God is happy essentially, and this can apply to no other, for nothing besides him can be the sovereign good, as may be gathered from what has been said. Hence it follows that whosoever besides him is happy by participation. Therefore, God's happiness surpasses all other happiness. Moreover, happiness consists in the perfect operation of the intellect, as we have proved. Now, no other intellectual operation is comparable with his operation. This is evident not only from its being a subsistent operation, but also by the one operation God understands himself perfectly as he is, as well as all things, both those which are and those which are not, both good and evil. Whereas in other intelligent beings, their act of understanding themselves is not subsistent, but the act of a subsistence. Nor can anyone understand God, the supremely intelligible, as perfectly as he perfectly is, since no one's being is perfect as the divine being is perfect, and no being's operation can be more perfect than its substance. Nor is there any other intellect that knows all those things, even which God can make, for then it would comprehend the divine power. Moreover, whatsoever things another intellect knows, it knows them not all by one same operation. Therefore, God is incomparably happy above all things. Again, the more united a thing is, the more perfect its power and goodness. Now, a successive operation is divided according to various portions of time. Wherefore its perfection can nowise be compared with the perfection of that operation which is simultaneously whole without any succession, especially if it pass not away in an instant, but abide eternally. Now, the divine act of intelligence is void of succession, since it exists eternally, simultaneously whole, whereas our act of understanding is successive, forasmuch as it is accidentally connected with continuity and time. Therefore God's happiness infinitely surpasses man's, even as the duration of eternity surpasses the passing now of time. Again, weariness and the various occupations which in this life must needs interrupt our contemplation, wherein especially consists human happiness, if there be any in this life, errors, doubts, and the various misfortunes to which the present life is subject, all these show that human happiness, especially in this life, cannot bear comparison with the happiness of God. Moreover, the perfection of the divine happiness may be gathered from the fact that it comprises all manner of happiness in the most perfect way. In regard to contemplative happiness, it contains the most perfect everlasting consideration of himself and other things. And in regard to active happiness, it comprises the governance, not of one man's life, or of one household, or city, or kingdom, but of the whole universe. False and earthly happiness is but a shadow of that most perfect happiness. For it consists of 5 things, according to Boethius, namely, pleasure, wealth, power, honor, and renown. But God has the most supreme pleasure in himself, and universal joy in all good things, without any admixture of the contrary. For wealth he possesses in himself an all-sufficiency of all good things, as we have proved above. For power he has infinite might. For honor he has supremacy and governance over all things. For renown he has the admiration of every intellect which knows him in any degree whatever. To him, therefore, who is singularly happy, be honor and glory for ever and ever. Amen. End of chapter 102. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. End of Summa Contra Gentiles, first book, On God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province.